Hello and welcome to today's show. If you were here yesterday waiting and you're back, thank you as well. Basically, we're here because James and I did a bad apologetics episode on the Shroud of Turin. Whenever we do these things or any of our other kind of stuff that we do individually as well, we have a kind of right to reply policy on most of our content and pretty much all of our content where people are very welcome to reach out to us if they object to anything that we're saying and they want to, kind of provide some pushback, have a conversation, anything like that. So Dale reached out to us because he's got a channel that's associated with, I believe exploring the Shroud mostly, but maybe apologetics more broadly. Do you want to introduce yourself for people who don't know you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I'm the host of a podcast called Real Seekers. So I basically do apologetics in general, and I love the philosophy of religion. That's kind of my area there. And one of my main sub interests is the Shroud of Turin. So I've founded this series called the Shroud Wars, where I invite on experts on both sides, skeptic and pro-shroud. And so far as I know, I think I'm the only channel that actually brings both sides together to debate and discuss the issues. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Yeah, and I think you were even interested in trying to set James and I up to talk to, some of the sort of pro-shroud experts like Bob Rutger. Unfortunately, wasn't free or didn't want to. I can't remember the response exactly, but I mean, appreciate you trying to sort of set those things up for us as well, because we like having these sorts of conversations.
Absolutely.
So you disagreed with, I think you liked a lot of the stuff that we did as well, like you had nice things to say, but you obviously disagree with some parts of it as well. So that's what we're going to be talking about. What bit of that do you want to kind of go into first?
Yeah, well, I guess, first of all, just to start off, like I said, I am very appreciative when, because I think you guys admitted you were kind of new to the Shroud. You spent a couple days researching prior to that. So I was very impressed with the job you guys did in terms of, just gaining all of the various bits and pieces and how they fit together and stuff like that. So I think you guys did a phenomenal job for being new at it. But yeah, obviously for myself, I did recognize some things where I think you got stuff wrong and that sort of thing. So I guess just to kind of start off, I'll start off. My first thing is kind of a question for you guys, and it's where you kind of started in the video. You really you had this timeline starting from the 14th century. Everything before that was blank. We'll get to that. But you mentioned right at the beginning of the 14th century, you think that there is good evidence, and you mentioned the Pilgrim's Badge as evidence. And then you cite a papal bull. You don't go to what a lot of online skeptics would, the 1389 Darcy Memorandum. So I was just curious, was that something deliberate on your part, or what was the story? Why did you guys skip the Darcy Memorandum?
So in terms of that part of it, I mean, I kind of produced that timeline just in my notes as I was figuring out what's going on. Don't think, it may or may not reflect James's views fully. He looked more at the sort of scientific aspect of it as well. So, but I don't know what other kind of sources he might have come across. And it just kind of
Sorry.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Nathan. I thought we talked about the memorandum. It may not have been. I'm just trying to find the link.
Yeah, I don't think
it may not have been on the timeline.
Well, let me find the timeline and bring it up.
Well, that would be embarrassing if I missed it, if it is there, but I didn't notice it. So.
Hang on, let me find it for you. Oop.
Assuming it's not there, that was something I was gonna give you a compliment on, because okay, I can't read that, but
whereabouts are we looking?
So this is 1389, so around
1389. This is,
you do have it.
Yeah, there it is.
This berry.
Well, it's listed as 1390, but I presume that's it there.
Yeah.
Okay, so you guys do mention so the reason I kind of ask about this is basically a lot of skeptics will bring up this 1389 Darcy Memorandum that supposedly mentions an official inquiry from about 34 years earlier in the 1350s, where an artist supposedly confesses that the shroud is just a cleverly devised painting. Now, this is really bad evidence from just a historian's point of view, right? So there are a number of problems. Number one, it was never signed or dated. So it was never. It looks like it was never sent. It's kind of a rough draft from the scribe of this bishop. He doesn't cite any official documents from the previous inquiry or anything like that. As well, there's translation issues as to what exactly is going on. Is it an artist or the artist who supposedly painted and confessed to painting the shroud? But the number one damning thing is we have external documents, which you guys do mention in terms of the papal bulls and stuff like that. Now, the issue with those is I don't think the papal bulls help, because there's a lot of waffling. There's going back and forth where the Pope kind of supports the Leary Church showing the shroud, and then he changes his mind 6 months later, and then towards the end he kind of changes back to supporting the Shroud of Turin. So I think that the Pope doesn't have a clue what's going on. He's just being a politician. He's I've got this dispute. Let me try and figure out what's going on with that. But I think the real most important document is a document signed and dated to May 1356, and it is by Bishop Troy's predecessor, Bishop Henry. This is the one who supposedly held this inquiry. And he doesn't mention an inquiry. He doesn't mention an artist confessing that the shroud is fake. Instead, he supports the Leary Church. He says he ratifies, praises, and endorses the divine cult, meaning showing the shroud to the pilgrims at that time. So it directly contradicts that. So, yeah, I guess I'll turn it to you guys. Were you guys aware of any of that in terms of these medieval documents, or did that come up at all?
So I haven't heard of an earlier document attributed to the previous bishop. Do you have a link towards that so I can look into that? Because if he explicitly, well, it's a little unclear to me, because of course the fact that someone says something at one time doesn't preclude them saying something different about it at another time. So he may have, it's entirely possible that he initially endorsed the shroud, looked into it, and then found that it was faked, right? So, but I don't know enough about the particulars to comment on that, because I hadn't come across that there was an earlier document.
So the only issue with that, I would say, is the bishop, the Geoffrey de Charny, died that same year in 1356. So there was no time for this inquiry to take place at a later time. But if you want sources, there's a great article written by a great series of historians, including Daniel Scavone. It's called "Deconstructing the Debunking of the Shroud," and it's got various historians. It's got about 7 or 8 authors. It's available online. I'm show it.
See if I can find it. It's on shroud.com, as everything is.
Yep. Good old Barry. Everything's there. So.
I'm guessing it's this. Is that the right?
Yep, that's it. So you can see the original article by Gary Vinken, but if you click on where it says "Deconstructing the Debunking of the Shroud,"
where are you looking? Sorry.
Right at the top, it has. Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you scroll down, you'll see other documents, and there it cites all the other documents that we have, including the Bishop Henry.
Yeah, I think sort of part of my problem with this, and I'm not saying that it's not necessarily true, but it's that I really want to see, if we're going this deep on it, I want to see the source material. Like, what do we actually have? Because this is kind of like a HTML page commentating on it. Now, maybe it's right, maybe it's not, but I want to kind of really contextualize all of these pieces of evidence.
Fair enough. I think that's a fair request, and I'll admit I've never read the originals myself, anyways. But just for whatever it's worth, I've never known any Shroud skeptics or anything in the know that have denied these documents. And it seems like, because you guys do cite some of the papal bulls there. Did you guys see the original documents for that, or at least a translation?
Yeah, it's not basically in terms of what I was doing with my Obsidian chart. Like, I was kind of dealing with sources written by sort of historians who I trust, like like people like, say, Dale Allison, or the author of that book, What Did Jesus Look Like? Like, these are people who I'm kind of giving like a high degree of credibility to, and I'm sort of trusting that they're depending on good sources themselves. So when they're quoting sources, I am making that assumption for sure that like they're accurately representing like the best quality first-hand evidence that we have. Now, maybe it's true, maybe they're not doing that, and like I'd be willing to kind of like go a level deeper and find out that's wrong. I guess like just initially when I'm coming across this, though, part of the reason that I'm more skeptical of this to those other cases is just because I don't actually know like any of these people or their backgrounds, whereas I do in the case of these other scholars. So I'm not giving it the same credibility. Like, I'm dealing with a reputable published book, so I put more trust in that than I do kind of like, something that's kind of in this format of a HTML page, and could be. It has a similar, to me, like, I don't mean this in an insulting way, but just initially it has the kind of look and feel of like a conspiracy website or something, rather than
Shroud.com.
Like a page like this, it has like to me like conspiracy vibes. So what I'm saying is that could all be wrong. That's a really weak leaning, right? But I'm just saying, like, at this level, this isn't like severely undermining anything for me. Like, I'd want to kind of go a step further and deal with some of these sources.
Well, for me, when I'm looking at sources like this, I just always want to know where the information comes from, particularly when it's obviously from a partisan source. And here, there's no reference here, so I don't know where they're getting this information from. I've not encountered this letter in other sources, but that doesn't mean that it's not true. Obviously, my main concern. So there's a concern about, like, I want a bit more information here, and I would like a proper reference. But also, it's just entirely unclear to me what the letter actually is about, because the only quote that they make is they say they praise, ratify, and approve of a divine cult of this sort. That doesn't say anything about the shroud. The chapel that was established there, whatever the name of the village was, presumably had a number of services, artifacts, or other aspects of that attracted pilgrims, or that were the basis of the initial endowment that was made. So it's just really not obvious that is referring to the shroud. So I don't really know that this is evidence that the shroud. I don't see how this is evidence that the shroud existed and that this guy approved of it, because it just doesn't say anything about that.
Well, so believe it or not, so this is, I'm friends with a historian, Shroud historian. He's pro-Shroud. His professional trade is a lawyer, so that's his credentials. But he knows the history. He's actually looked at the original documents, and he's done a debate with the Shroud skeptic Hugh Ferry on these medieval documents in detail. And I remember he was arguing in terms of the divine cult. The reason we can link that with the shroud, again, in context, we know they were showing the shroud of Jesus in the 1350s. Even you guys agreed with that, right? Like, that's not deniable. But the church at Leary wasn't known for having relics of Jesus. It was known for worship, for Mary worship or something like that. So by using that divine cult, that is specifically relating it to Jesus. It's not.
How do you know that? Sorry, like, how do you know that they? Well, when you say they weren't known for having relics, like, that's fairly ambiguous, right? Because does that mean that they never had any relics? That they had, 5 relics a year, where normally there'd be like 1,000 in other places, or
Well, Leary is a tremendously small church, and Geoffrey de Charny was the one who built it. He just built it like 5 years prior. So it wasn't like an established cathedral where people would be donating relics and stuff like that. Nobody went to Leary to
Well,
donate.
except for the
relics.
burial shroud of Jesus, apparently.
Yeah, so that's look, that wasn't delivered by pilgrims. We would have to get into, well, how did Geoffrey de Charny get this? And this is a problem for you guys as Shroud Skeptics too, right? We have to ask this. Well, how did it end up in this small church out in the middle of nowhere and stuff like
But
that?
I'm not making the. I don't claim to know what was happening at that church, right? You're saying it wasn't known for relics, but then somehow it had the burial shroud of Jesus. I don't really know what it was doing or what it was showing at that time. I just find this small snippet here from an unsourced HTML page extremely unconvincing that the shroud existed and was approved by that bishop there. I don't know what he was talking about in that letter. And I don't really buy this argument that, well, we know that the divine cult must have been referring to the shroud because that church wasn't known to have other relics, so it must have been that relic, and he must have been approving of that. That just seems to me a lot of inferences on inferences there that aren't really substantiated. Also, a question that I have is why his successor then made up the idea of an inquiry. What was that, a political motivation, do you think? Is he trying to... Well, I'm not sure why he would do that.
So Bishop Darcy has a provable financial motive to lie. And if you see the other documents, we see where Bishop Darcy is trying to get the shroud for himself. So, for example, he contacts the king, and a bailey actually comes. The king sends a bailey to get the shroud to deliver to Bishop Darcy, but they hide the shroud in the church of Leary, and he couldn't get it, so he just goes away. So I think there's definitely a proven financial motive. His church was going through financial difficulties at the time. Can I prove that, okay, he definitely lied because he wanted this? No.
So I thought, so which church was going through financial difficulties?
So Bishop Darcy was the bishop of the church in Troy. So the one in Troy, the main church.
I thought, okay, and that's where Bishop Henry was as well. But I thought that was the local area where the shroud was located. Or is that a different area?
Yeah, so that's in a little place like...
Yeah, it's not the main... Yeah.
And Leary was outside the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Troy there. So, yeah, it's like a suburb, or like, just outside the city, I guess.
So you're saying that the idea was the Bishop of Troy was in financial trouble, so he wants to get the shroud for himself to display. So he wants to have it declared fake and then take it and then display it as genuine.
So I think if you look at the external documents, again, there is speculation here, but I think the best explanation is he wanted to get a hold of it at first, and that's why he's going to the king to try and retrieve it. But once he realizes he's not going to get it, that's when he starts going, okay, well, I'm going to have the Pope. If I can't have it, no one will. And so I'm going to get the Pope to declare this fake, and then the pilgrims will bypass Leary and come to my church to make the donations and stuff like that. So again, that's just me giving my best explanation given the documents that we have. But
well, an alternative explanation is that he thought it was a fake because there was an earlier investigation, which is simply not referenced in that letter, which doesn't seem to talk about the shroud at all. And that he, like many at the time, was concerned about fake relics, and so he wanted to see it removed. That seems to be equally consistent with this data.
I don't think it is equally consistent. So if this is the case, let me just ask this, right? So one of the main things that all the scholars, when they talk about the Darcy Memorandum, they're asking, look, we have signed and dated documents from this period. They're all signed and dated, and in official inquiries have to be cited. So when we have a papal bull, if there was an inquiry, that would have to cite the inquiry and quote from it. By the way, Darcy was a meticulous lawyer. Everything else we have from him, so we have a historian in the 1600s named Nicholas Camusset, who wrote a history of Troyes, including about Bishop Darcy. And everything else we have from him, he gives quotations, he gives citations. Just in this memo, no citations. He doesn't even know the date. He's like, well, approximately 34 years ago, this inquiry happened. And again, assuming you believe this, you need to check into the source. But we also have that letter from the person who held the inquiry just 3 months before he died, saying there's no problem with the Church of Leary, everything's cool. So I think the evidence favors the pro-Shroud.
Well, so hang on. So just to clarify your argument there, so the new thing that you said in response to me saying that the evidence is consistent with either interpretation is that all of the other documents we have from the same person have you said they were signed and dated. That's the claim you made, right?
Yeah, I mean that's a must, right? If you're sending it out, you have to sign and date it.
Well, but the claim here that I saw, I can't remember where it was. I think the previous. Where did I see? Oh, it's at the top of this, right? It says that it's probably a draft.
Right.
Where did I see that? There's some link that. Was it this page that says that? Where am I getting that from?
I don't know if it's on this page, but it is. I mentioned it. Oh, there it is. And there's actually, I forget the name now, but on the back of it, there are the initials of Darcy's known scribe, or a scribe at the time. So
the copy we have may have been the draft that wasn't finalized with those details. Isn't that consistent with the fact that it doesn't have those details on it?
Sorry, so say that again.
So if the copy that is extant is indeed a draft, which is not finalized, which was not the version that was sent, then would that not explain the absence of those details?
Okay, so you're saying we just possessed the draft, but he did
Correct.
Indeed send the official letter. So if that was the case, then it would be in the Vatican archives. It would be official and would be signed and dated.
Is it in the Vatican archives?
It is not. And I
How
know,
do we know that?
So I know professional historian Dr. Cheryl White. She's been in the Vatican archives searching for these documents. It's not there.
I find that very unconvincing evidence as well. That the Vatican archives can be assumed to be complete about all correspondence that they've ever received back in the last 700 years. I know the Vatican archive keeps a lot, but also the fact that we can find everything that's there. That also seems to me very weak evidence.
Or even that this historian did actually, kind of go there, do that, and go through.
Because at the moment, what we're saying is that we're going to discount this letter because it's not signed and dated, even though that would just indicate that it's a draft. Because the original can't be found in the Vatican archives, that requires an assumption that the archives are complete and we can find everything there and that the appropriate search has been done and that they weren't there. I mean, NASA lost the original recordings of the moon landings from the 60s, right? I think they only discovered some of those recently, right? So I just find that incredibly weak evidence that there can't have been well, what would that actually mean? It would mean that the claim is that he drafted this letter, but then for some reason didn't send it. But if he was trying to get the shroud for himself, why wouldn't he have sent it? That doesn't really make sense either.
I suppose if I don't mean to kind of like gang up on you here, Dale, because I know James has kind of like said some stuff you probably want to come back on there.
Yeah,
but just even on this point, I don't know if it's a little bit of a red herring for sort of like tracking what we're actually trying to establish here about the origins of the shroud, right? So I think really to get to the bottom of this problem, we would have to carefully go through like the earliest best sources that we have, and kind of, which is probably a bit beyond what we're going to be able to do here. And I think maybe the real question would be, even if we granted everything that's sort of in this document, right, is true, like this is all exactly right, what does it establish? So maybe it would modify what we should believe a little bit, but I don't think it kind of goes any way to sort of invalidating the historical attestation then that the shroud really emerges in history around this time. So maybe the explanation would be different, right, in some way, like, oh, this guy, his reasons for saying it's a forgery, or he's got like different motives or something like that, and so we can't exactly trust straightforwardly that there was a good investigation into it that established it was a forgery or something. But still, it would kind of be emerging in history at this time. The best evidence that we have is all situated around here. Maybe we still make sense of this investigation in some way. It might do something. It might not be just straightforwardly established it's a forgery. But, I guess maybe what's the scope of the claim that you're trying to make that's kind of pro-Shroud if we do accept everything that's in this document?
Yeah, so I think I think you guys raise a totally fair point about checking into these and wanting to look further just based on a website. So I agree with you guys there. And on my end, I'll do my best to reach out to my contacts and try to see if I can get those sources for you guys. But I think the point, assuming everything I have here is correct, and at least Dale Allison affirms part of it in terms of the papal bulls because it's in his book. So at least part of it you guys can confirm. But the point that I want to get here is this is a Shroud Skeptic claim. So it's the Shroud Skeptic who has the burden of proof. You guys on this front are saying, look, we can prove, and we know the Shroud is medieval, and indeed even further that it's just a painting. It's a cleverly devised painting. Why? Because we have this document that says so, dating to 40 years after the event. And I've been raising all these problems as kind of defeaters, undercutting defeaters, to hopefully get you to at least the agnostic stage and say, well, you know what? Actually, I shouldn't. I'm not warranted in believing the Shroud is medieval on this basis, at the very least, until I get more details. So that's kind of been my goal, is to bring you back to agnosticism.
I think that's fair enough. Or just to say, for me, though, I think that attestation of it being a forgery really doesn't do very much to sort of like push me in one direction or another. Maybe it does for James, but and I'm not saying this like rhetorically to just undermine what you've tried to do. Like genuinely, like that is kind of, for me, it's like a marker of where it emerges in history. But I guess the thing that I care about explaining is, why do we only have good evidence of it appearing historically at this time and not at other times? You know, like we can't really track its provenance before that. So that, for me, in terms of the evidence in this area, the big thing that leans in favor of it having medieval origins is that fact rather than some other fact. So it doesn't matter if the details about reports of it being a forgery so much for me. Though if you want to reply to that, feel free. If James has a separate point.
Just one quick follow-up question, because it'll be relevant when we come to another section, but I think it's important. I just want to ask you before James comes back and we'll finish this section. But now you say so the only time we get good evidence for the Shroud is from this period. Now,
well, as far as I'm aware, like maybe there's something you can produce, you know, that'll
and I'll try to do that. But you guys are aware that there are documents mentioning a sindon or an image cloth back centuries earlier than this. But you guys say
I mean, I've got a few tablecloths over here. You know, like there's a lot of cloths in the world. Like
right. So you guys, your main argument, which is valid, and we'll have to get to it. How do you link that to the Shroud of Turin? Now, I want to say the same thing, but the same problem applies to these medieval documents, because you'll get Shroud Skeptics. They're seen as Looney Tunes on the other side, but they'll say, well, none of these documents talk about the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin was invented by Leonardo da Vinci, and they're not. It's Clive Prince and Lynn Picknett, and I was scolded because I used to make fun of them and mock them, but they're not as dumb as might appear, stuff like that. So, like, I just wanted to ask, like, how are you linking these documents? I mean, the word Shroud of Turin is nowhere there. So why are you...
Sure. Yeah. So it's not going to be, you know, obviously like the name calling it that is sort of like a later thing. Yeah. The thing that I think is very difficult to explain, if you kind of reject that it's the same item, is going to be stuff relating to the fire, the sort of like people who are involved. Like you're gonna kind of have like a bunch of different sources that describe the handling and possession of an item, you know, maybe it's not the Shroud of Turin, but then the problem that's going to occur is that you have to kind of like hypothesize that they're like swapping out different cloths, having cloths that just happen to be involved in, you know, treatment of either being sewn or being burnt or whatever, that then happens to multiple different items. So you've got that independently occurring multiple times. And so you just end up overall with all of those different causal pieces with like a very bad explanation if you've got different kind of bit cloths appearing and disappearing at different points here.
Fair enough. Yeah, I'll let James get the last word on this section if he has anything to say. Or if you're good.
I would just reiterate what Nathan said about the fact that we have continuous documented history of the Shroud from the sort of late 14th century to the present about its ownership and people describing it and how it was displayed. And we have images of it as well from various points in this period. We don't have anything like that prior to that. As far as I'm aware, we have sort of general descriptions of other images of Jesus, but nothing to link it specifically to this cloth. So the historical documentation is radically different between like pre and post 14th century. Another reason, by the way, that I would cite is to think that this shroud described in these documents is in fact the shroud that's currently displayed in Turin is the carbon dating, which I know you're not going to regard that as evidence, but as a skeptic, right, I think, well, that fits the documentary evidence very well. So that's why I would regard that as equivalent, as referring to this shroud.
Awesome. Yeah. And perfect segue, because that was the next major topic. The next thing is obviously Shroud Skeptics, when they make their claim, they appeal to the carbon-14 dating, right? This is case closed for a lot of people. So I noticed that you guys, so I guess the first thing I'll say that I think was good is that in your assessment of the invisible reweave hypothesis, which is by far the most popular hypothesis, I myself rejected on the same grounds that you guys gave. You guys gave 2 out of 3 objections that I think are good objections. So, the first one you mentioned, John Jackson, the striations issue go through the patch area. The other thing is the 2002 restoration project. An invisible reweave, it's always visible, at least under a compound microscope. A textile expert should have picked that up in 2002. And there is a third one that you guys missed, I think. But this is from Bob Rucker, where basically the calculations, if we were going to get a 30 AD cloth giving us a medieval date on the basis of averaging 30 AD material and then 1500s material with the patch, 80%, over 80% of the material would have to be from the 1500s to get that result. And that would be readily apparent, and it's not.
Yeah, I think we mentioned something like that at one point or other.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, maybe just briefly. It wasn't long, James. I don't criticize you for not remembering every single thing we said.
I don't think we performed the calculations, but I think we sort of like speculated on whether, like, what would that hypothesis predict, and is that consistent?
Yeah, because I saw other people mentioning this point. I saw some somewhat different calculations, but it's clear that the large majority of the material would have to have been added, which seems like it's very hard to see how that would not be observed.
Fair enough. So believe it or not, so all 3 of us, we are actually in agreement on that. But the first question I just want to have is for people that do defend the invisible reweave, they have pointed to certain empirical evidences ranging from the cotton to the fact that certain yellow matter dye or Arabic gum binders are found and stuff like that. I think Al Adler found certain salts or something that indicated a difference. I'm just curious. Did you
just
guys
out of interest here? I didn't look into many of those things. I saw those kind of claims dotted around, and I guess for I kind of like thought I've only got so much time. These are quite weak evidence. So, but I what I would be interested in though is sort of like if you took an item that was like similar and everyone agreed beforehand that it was definitely like a fake or something from the medieval period. The problem is that I don't think that there's an item readily available that's exactly like that. But then if you subjected it to similar tests, I'd be really interested to see like what kind of things would you find if you subjected it to the same sorts of tests? Like, would you find all these random, like you agree that it's a linen cloth that was painted on with some kind of pigment and was exposed over 1,000 or so years to various things, and then do you find basically similar traces of like conflicting materials and random things? Because then at least you're kind of getting a good comparison between what you should expect if it was a forgery versus something else, which unfortunately we don't kind of have that as well.
Yeah, makes sense. So okay, cool. So but yeah, I just kind of wanted to ask you, just for the sake of those, because Joe Marino is a friend of mine, and he's the one who kind of invented this theory. So I was just wondering if you guys looked into those evidences, and do you think that at the very least it may be cause for reasonable doubt that it is a plausible option to consider, or do you think it's proven beyond all reasonable doubt? There's no way this is true.
I think it depends what you mean here by like reasonable doubt, right? I mean, I think there's a part of me that sort of is interested in the web of consistency, right? Like that, I'm kind of like fascinated by the fact that people who are super into this seem to be able to tell a consistent story. And in like, I want to map that out, but I don't know why I'm interested in that and whether I consider it reasonable or not. Like, I'm pretty settled that that stuff isn't very convincing or isn't like a reasonable explanation. But I don't know that I don't know if I want to call everyone who is in the same position unreasonable, especially because some of them have much more evidence than me as well. So that kind of like temper. So it's going to depend on the individual, really. I don't know if you want to answer that for yourself, though, James.
Well, I would say it is not reasonable to defend the thesis that the reason the Shroud carbon dated to the 14th century was because of some invisible reweaving. Now, I will caveat that though by saying that what is reasonable depends on what assumptions you're making. And so there are people obviously who make certain assumptions about the Shroud based on other worldviews. And so there can, as sort of Nathan was saying, there are consistent stories you can tell given those assumptions. But my opinion is that those assumptions and the results of them are not reasonable given the evidence that we have. So it involves making, I think, assumptions that are simply not warranted with the evidence, at least about that specific point.
Fair enough. Okay. All right. So my second question, before I get to the main thing I want to discuss with you guys, again, similar questions, but obviously this is undeniable. They only dated a single sample location. And originally, there was this thing called the Turin Protocol. They were supposed to date 3 different locations to kind of mitigate against contamination problems, stuff like that. Now, with the dating of the single sample, even Dr. Harry Gov, he's the one who co-invented AMS carbon-14 dating. He was an atheist. He hated pro-Shroudies. He was the one in charge of, or one of the leaders, I should say, of dating the Shroud in 1988.
I'll take your word for it.
Yeah, he's written a book in 1996. Yeah, trust me, he's well known in the Shroud community. Not in a good light on the pro-Shroud side, but even he admits when he found out about this change in procedure, he was outraged, and he wrote an open letter to the Pope saying, this change in procedure from 3 samples down to 1 sample, and he was also upset because they changed it from 7 labs down to 3. This change in procedure is ill-advised as it will not generate a reliable date, but will rather lead to worldwide controversy in the scientific community. We suggest that it would be better not to date the Shroud at all. So this is Harry Gov saying this. So I'm just wondering, like, what is your guys' take on the fact that they only dated a single sample, and we have this enemy attestation saying it's not reasonable to rely on it?
I don't know that you're fairly representing his views. I need to read the context of what he was saying. So I do agree that it is not scientifically appropriate to change a protocol that was already agreed upon. And in that sense, it does sort of raise questions because you shouldn't do that, right? So yeah, I agree that it's scientifically inappropriate, and I blame those responsible for changing that. I don't really know why they did that. Probably just wanted to damage the Shroud less, I'm guessing. But as to the inference that it makes the resulting dates, what was the phrase that you used?
We're unwarranted in placing our faith on it because they only dated this 1 sample. So we shouldn't believe the
wouldn't phrase it that way personally, but the fact that they're only a single sample is dated, I don't think has any bearing on the on how much we can on how much confidence we can place in the results. That's a very common practice to only date 1 section of an artifact. The paper in which the dates of the Shroud were published, they dated 3 other artifacts. As far as I know, they only extracted a single sample from those as well. I don't know if it gives the details of that, but I strongly suspect that that's what they did, and because the same protocol was supposed to be followed. And those all dated to when we know those artifacts are provenance to. So No, I think it would have been better. You do get higher confidence when you take 3 different samples, obviously, and that even aside from that, the protocol had been agreed on, so it should have been followed. So I agree with that criticism, but I don't really think it significantly in any way reduces our confidence in the dating, because the evidence from a single sample is more than sufficient.
I guess the way I'd think about it is that the evidence, I agree with everything James has said there about like it could be stronger, but I still think the evidence that we do have should push us up to something in like the 90%, in terms of like the range we're dating it in, like 90% confident. And then we're kind of like quibbling over what would have put it at like 99.999% kind of thing, And I agree that it would be much harder for people who wanted to kind of deny that conclusion to kind of like explain why it would be the case. And I'm kind of all for that.
I don't agree with that. I think we'd see almost exactly the same arguments. I don't want to speak to you, Dale. I'm not
multiple invisible weaves,
casting aspersions on you specifically.
I think we'd see them.
I'm speaking generally that I think more or less the same arguments would be made.
Yeah, I think we would. I'm not saying we wouldn't see them. I guess what I'm saying is that the kind of like revisions they'd become like even more ad hoc. I mean, I already think they're very ad hoc, but I think that I don't know. I think it's pretty obviously ad hoc, like the invisible weave type stuff. But then if you're saying, and there's like multiple invisible weaves or something like that, then it's like, oh, come on,
Yeah. Okay. Well, okay. So I did want to transition into the explanation that I go into, and that's the neutron absorption hypothesis of people like Bob Rucker and stuff like that. And I kind of said, I think I said to you guys, I thought this was an area where you guys were kind of weak in your 10-hour video, because you didn't reference Bob Rucker, who's a nuclear engineer. He spent 40 years in the nuclear industry, using the top software in the entire world, the MCNP, Monte Carlo neutron particle software. And he's done extensive calculations testing out his hypothesis. It is a rigorous scientific hypothesis that is readily and easily falsifiable if we could ever get permission to, carbon date some of the threads that have already been removed from the shroud. But yeah, so I guess I'll just kind of, okay, I'll start this way. So in terms of the raw
just
data,
to pause before, so I think just on the point of the stuff you just said, I just would like to make a little comment about that, which is, it's sort of as if, I don't know, imagine, I don't know your whole belief system, so I'm trying to find like a appeal in an example to a belief you have that, you'd obviously agree to. So I'm thinking like, I don't know, maybe you accept climate change, but then like maybe you don't, or old Earth or something like that. But the sort of like the dialogical context that we're in right now, it's almost as if you were like, look, I believe in climate change because of what all the experts have to say about it. And then I was like, but look, Dr. Bloboshenko went to, Big Brain University, and he's done the calculations with the most advanced scienceometer, and it says climate change is fake. Like, I mean, I'm not denying that all the stuff you say there could be true, but in the context that we're in right now, it's kind of like that, where it's kind of like, you're presenting sort of one view of some guy. It's pretty common for someone with like an engineering degree to kind of get a hobby horse and become a bit of a crank on something, particularly, you see this all the time in young earth creationism and climate change. There's even lists of hundreds of engineers who aren't specialists in the field who cite these sort of things. So again, I'm not saying that this should completely undermine, like maybe there's actually good content in terms of what I think you're about to go on to say, but I don't think the stuff that you have said there should really do much in terms of persuading us right now. Maybe it would do in future. I just wanted to kind of lay that caveat. So thanks.
Yeah, I think so. Obviously this format it's limited, right? Like you're going to need to go back and read the papers and stuff like that. I can attest, you guys know of Jordan from the Reason to Doubt podcast. You guys were very respectful. He has read extensively Bob's work, and he's never objected to the calculation part. So maybe a little bit of enemy attestation just is the best I can do on the spot here. But so there is no issue of the calculations. And one thing I would say,
can you just explain to us and the audience what the hypothesis is and what the calculations show? Just to summarize that, maybe you were going to do that. Sorry.
Yeah. So okay. So if you don't mind, maybe I'll start with the raw data first, and then I'll get into that.
Yeah,
Is
sure,
that
sure.
okay? Or yeah. Okay. So the reason the raw data is important to start with there is because we have to. What does a hypothesis have to explain? And it's not enough to just explain the average values. Oh, we got these raw data 1260 to 1390 AD. Right. That's one piece of data we got. Another piece of data you guys yourself presented on you called it the heterogeneity of the data, right? So that all of the data based on the 12 subsamples that each of the labs got creates a gradient or a slope in the data. Bob has calculated that to 36 years per centimeter from the edge of the cloth to as you move in towards the center of the cloth. For every centimeter, it gets younger by 36 years. So this is a data point that we have to explain. You guys have your explanation.
Well, let's maybe pause on that, right? So there are some parameters that we have to explain. That's correct. But any inferences done on top of those parameters might not be part of the data, but they might be inferences from those parameters, right? And I think that that's the direction that this is probably where that's going to go in. Because if we're talking about average values and error bars and things like that, I mean, again, we have to get into the actual details of the argument being made. But if, for example, if we take means of some data sets at 2 points, we can, draw a line, and that's not necessarily a good indication. Even 3 points is really not a good indication that there's some kind of real underlying phenomena, but where that gradient isn't produced due to chance or something else. So I'd have to look very carefully at these equations and what's been done in this analysis to kind of like figure out why he's reached that conclusion, because it could kind of be a statistical ghost,
Well, okay. Well, to back him up, though, there have been 6 peer-reviewed journals, all independently of Bob Rucker, all saying the same thing, right? The most famous is that 2017 paper published in Archaeometry by Tristan Casabianca. And it's not like they just had 1 or 2 data points. They had a total of 12 subsamples.
Yeah, I'd have to look at this again, though, because, like, for example, one thing I did see one guy talking about this on a podcast I listened to, right? And I couldn't even wrap my head around the argument he was making, because he was saying that it was a chi-squared analysis, but a chi-squared is for categorical data. So it's like, but we're not even dealing with categorical data. So I just had no idea. Basically, I will need to get into the details to really have reasons to accept or reject this, but it's not looking good just on the surface, there's a lot of red flags that I've seen and that's kind of what's put me off getting into the details down this avenue, basically.
Okay. Well, in terms of the chi-square thing, I'll admit I don't know, because I'm not a technical person myself, and even though I have read this, but the chi-square test is, from my understanding, standard. This is what the carbon-14 scientists used in 1988 and published in the journal Nature. They used or misused, I would say.
But if they're dealing with the type of data that they're dealing with, I mean, I'd have to look into it, but just maybe you can comment on this, James, but I think, like, why shouldn't they be using some other test, like a t-test or something like that? Why are they using chi-squared for which?
Well, it depends on the statistical hypothesis being tested, but the point about establishing a gradient between or a linear relationship between distance and date, that's going to require some sort of correlation analysis, not a chi-square. And I'm just looking at the graph again, and it does seem. Can I actually show this? This might be helpful. This is. I know there are different versions of these plots because, as you say, different papers have looked at it. This is the one that I included, and I don't.
Can you maybe if you zoom in, and also I think dark mode might be doing us dirty a little bit.
Hang on, let me.
There you go.
This I think is from this Walsh paper here. At least that's where I've placed it.
Also,
double check.
Dale with the sunglasses, no chance he can see dark mode as well.
Even without the sunglasses, it would be even worse. But there's clearly a slope, right? So that my understanding, and I may be getting these technical details wrong because I'm not one of the statisticians and stuff, but the chi-square is used for the plus or minuses. It gives you that. That's what was used to say, oh, we have a 95% degree of certainty. And at one point, you guys were saying, well, 90% is good enough. No, it's not. If you don't have 90%, if your data isn't within,
I think you're talking about confidence. I think what you're talking about here is maybe like confidence levels rather. Yeah. Whereas I was talking about like credences. So just not to be careful that we don't equivocate between those two.
Fair enough. Well, I think the former is what they're using the chi-square test for, right? They're saying we are claiming 95% confident that the actual calendar age of the shade dates within this range that we're giving you. And what the statistics have shown with the actual data since 2017 is that's not true because of this gradient. There's a 98.6% probability. Don't ask me how that was calculated, but it was based on the data of a systematic error or bias in the results. And my understanding of the systematic bias means
that's correct.
Linear.
You're right. I don't disagree with that. But it's important to understand what we can infer from that and what we can't infer from that. But I want to come back to this slope point because I think that this is crucial for as I understand it, it's important for the neutron hypothesis. The slope point here is shows I was going to say 12, but maybe two of them are on top of each other. I think there should be 12 points shown here.
12.
And yes. And so for our viewers, what happened is that the section of the shroud that was sampled from in 1988 was cut into three and sent to three different labs. Each of those labs in turn divided up into 3 or 4. Maybe it was 4 in all cases. I'm not sure if Oxford only did 3, but they cut it up into a number of different sub-pieces and then dated those independently. Or maybe Zurich did 5 and Oxford did 3, so it was like 12 in total. Anyway, that's a minor point. So that's what we're talking about with the 12 subsamples of the 3 samples. And so what we're seeing in the graph here is the vertical axis shows the radiocarbon dating as years before present. So that hasn't been normalized. And then on the x-axis is the distance of that sample, those subsamples from the edge. So we do see 12 subpoints here, but note that the distance from the edge is the same in each of the 3 lab samples because of the way the sample was collected. So the actual, and this is critical because it means that the attribution of a slope really only has 3 different data points to it, which is the distance of each of the samples given to the 3 different labs. And what this particular graph shows is that the slope only emerges due to the presence of Oxford, which is sort of an outlier. That if you move the other labs up by 88 years, or equivalently, I guess you could move Oxford down, then the slope becomes insignificant. So the point that I would make about...
there's a causal reason to think Oxford is different.
Yes, but that's at the moment, I'm just speaking purely statistically, right?
Yeah.
And all I'm saying here is that the statistical inference of a slope, which we then extrapolate to the center, is, I think, not warranted by this data. What we should be saying is not that there's a slope, but that Oxford is an outlier. That is that is what I think statistically is the appropriate inference here. Now, Nathan has just then mentioned the fact that this paper, and I think others, have hypothesized the reason why Oxford differs from the others, but that is an explanation. At the moment, I'm just saying I don't accept that it's established that there's this sort of statistical slope here. What I think we can say is that Oxford is an outlier, and that is what you were saying, Dale, before about this 98-something% probability of there being a systematic bias, which I agree with, and this is reflected by the fact that Oxford is different. But what I don't accept is that it's reasonable to extrapolate that out as a relationship between distance and date that we can extrapolate beyond these samples, because I don't think that's warranted by these data.
Yeah, just a last point to build on that would be if you were to redo the calculations with just the Arizona and Switzerland samples, for example, like what kind of confidence would you get that the results were due to some kind of bias or error, right? So you want to basically, and I think that, I don't know, because I'd have to actually perform the calculations to give you a number, but it's like if that comes out very, very low, for example, I think that's going to kind of undermine the points that's being made. So I think a lot of, the reason that I think that would undermine the point that's being made is because it's slightly based on maybe a misunderstanding of some of the apparatus of the statistical tools, and thinking, that when something like that is said, that it translates to like an ordinary language statement of, we can't have confidence in these data or something like that. Whereas that doesn't mean confidence for you as an agent in what the data shows in some particular way, but it's confidence in some very specific particular statistical test, right? That you have to get into the kind of weeds of for it to be valuable.
Okay. So here's how I'm going to respond then. In terms of the raw data that we have, I'm going to leave one important surprise bit of raw data out, but until we get into the explanations, because I think that's going to clearly favor mine, that there is this slope, and it's not the thing that you guys are saying. So in terms of the raw data, I am correct. We do have this 98.6% probability of a systematic bias. We all agree on that. Great. We can ask, well, what is that bias? What's causing that? But that does mean, technically speaking, with the data we have, just with the data we have, don't speculate, does it keep going into the future and stuff like that? Just with the data we have, there is this gradient in the data. Sorry, I'm losing track. Okay. Oh, sorry. And it equals about 3 sigma levels of difference. So that means we don't have a 95% degree of confidence in the results. That's the raw data that we have from the carbon-14. So we have to come up with explanations for how do we explain what is causing this systematic bias that we're observing just within this finite set of data. And on your guys' end, so the natural explanation that you guys go for is the one suggested by Brian Walsh, right? So, well, Oxford Labs had a difference in their cleaning procedure. They were unique. They used petroleum ether or something like that. Maybe we don't know. We have no proof that this is what is causing it, but we're going to hypothesize maybe this is what is causing this.
Well, technically, this data would be proof in a way. Well, when you say proof, I think, again, we're not being like cautious enough. But this would be the evidence that we're trying to explain.
Well,
right?
well, this explanation is postulated to account for the statistical difference. So we don't have additional evidence for that. But we do know that there was a difference in procedure. That part is not speculative. What is speculative is that the difference in procedure led to...
is caused by this. Yeah.
Exactly. Because there's another equally probable explanation, which is the neutron absorption, which also equally explains the same data that we have. And again, that's where Bob... you're gonna have to trust me for here, but look into it. See if what I'm saying is BS or not.
You just want to explain what the basic idea of the proposal, just so everyone's on the same page.
Absolutely. So what Bob's hypothesis is that basically at the time of Jesus's resurrection in 30 AD, a miracle happened. Right? There's no getting around that. We believe in supernatural miracles. So let's just get on board with that. And at some point, when Jesus' body was in the midst of this resurrection, certain particles or a fraction of certain particles, such as neutrons in Jesus' body, were released. And this neutrons will inevitably affect carbon-14 dating. They will add carbon-14 content to the cloth, making it appear younger than it actually is if you were to do a carbon-14 dating. And James did an excellent job. It brought me back to my young Earth creationist days, 10 years ago or so. Getting into how carbon-14 dating works in terms of the equilibrium and the atmosphere and all of that. So that's in a nutshell. He's basically saying that neutrons from within Jesus' body were released, and a natural byproduct of that is that it would influence the carbon-14 content. Now, what Bob has done that's unique is he's done the calculations using MCMP. Okay, well, if this happened, let's suppose, how would that create the results that we got with the carbon-14 dating, including the gradient, including the average dates, including the range of dates? And the answer is yes to all of those. But in addition, he has two additional data points that he includes that I haven't mentioned yet. But I just wanted to set that up for the audience. So far, I will admit with you guys that both again, unless you have other reasons to dismiss miracles or something like that, the neutron absorption and the natural explanation by Brian Walsh appear to be equally likely in explaining just that raw data that I've mentioned to this point.
I'm not. I think you could be right about that. I don't know, basically, without looking at this further. But as I kind of said before, I do think if I take the time to look at this further, the case for this being like a statistical ghost is going to become stronger. Because I'd kind of what I'd want to play around with is like the probability of like 3 random points producing a gradient due to chance or something like that, and kind of play like, and then compare. There's a bunch of stuff I'd want to do to kind of articulate what I think is going on and test for if that is going on. And similarly with these
and just so now, are you actually capable of doing those calculations? Because if you are, that would be
but it would take. But I've got so much on that it would. Maybe I'll do it, but I'll see. But the point is though, then for the, and then similarly, the test that's been performed under the neutron emission, I want to look into that. Like, what was it that was like when you're saying this is a good gradient, like, is there some kind of, again, the probability of this causal story producing a gradient of that form being due to chance is less than some significance level? Why is that the right sort of test? Like, there's a lot of methodological questions about what's going on here that, I mean, I'm not saying maybe it is all there, right? And I'll agree with it every step of the way, but without going into those details, I just can't say. But I want to just park all that for a second, though, to address the stuff you're saying about miracles.
Right.
And the reason that I want to say that is because, I actually think that this harms your case for miracles in some ways, because it's so. If you think of all the claim is that God resurrects someone is the miracle, right? And then if you think of all the ways that God can resurrect someone, well, very few of them involve emissions of neutron radiation. So the problem is that that's going to, like, again, it depends how you want to approach a miracle type argument, but that's going to give you like a massively lower prior because of all of the ways that God could do it, that when you kind of like stipulate this very specific causal mechanism, even if it has a high likelihood, you've massively reduced the prior as well. So, I'm not certain. I'd have to, again, go into all the details of that, but I'm not even certain it does help the case. The fact that you can produce some specific, the case for a miracle, that is, or God intervening to do this, the fact that you could have some kind of neutron radiation, but that would get into basically like this generic point about what should we believe when we have like weird data, like, should we think that there's some mysterious natural force or something that we're not aware of versus God intervening there's like just general points there. So maybe that's just a different point entirely.
Well, do you want me to respond to that then, or just?
I mean, absolutely feel free to. I just think that discussion is like a massive discussion in and of itself. Outside
it is, yeah. Okay. Well, so I'll just say 2 quick things, and then I'll move on then out of respect. So, the first thing I'll say is, so believe it or not, in terms of the neutron absorption hypothesis, there are natural versions. You don't have to go for a miracle. So, for example, there was a peer-reviewed paper that was published, and then unfortunately it was retracted because of a conflict of interest. But these were unbelievers. They believed the shroud was produced naturally through because neutrons are released during an earthquake in the tombs in Jerusalem. Now, unfortunately, Bob's calculations falsify that. It can't give us the results that we got with the 1988 results if it was external neutron radiation or something from an earthquake or something like that. So I don't know how that worked. It wouldn't give us the precise results that we got if that was the cause.
Well, I would say I guess the point I was going with is, why not unknown natural cause? Like that the point is, this is where it gets into like this general point about what you should believe. Like there's a Substack I'm writing about this common response people give, where they'll say, well, if that's true, then if the planets spelt in the sky made by God, you wouldn't be justified in believing, that was a miracle. And I think in a technical sense, there's something here that's actually true. I mean, it depends on whether you're asking the question for someone with like pure priors, so no knowledge about like language or anything like that, or if you're asking it for me. But then from my point of view, I think if I see that, the more likely explanation is like I'm having a mental episode, or like, you know, I need to get to a hospital pretty quickly. There's probably some conditions you could specify that would sort of do away with all that stuff as well eventually. But, you know, just seeing that should convince me of something else. So the point is, in this case, suppose that I came to believe that there was neutron radiation on the Shroud. I think that what I should believe is that there's some weird, like, natural process that I don't know about that human bodies can do when they die that happens very, very infrequently.
Well, hang on. I think you're jumping the gun a bit here, Nathan, because all that Dale is trying to establish, as I understand it, is that the 14th century data, the 14th century dating data, can be explained by a different hypothesis than what we were postulating. So,
I'm saying even if you grant that, there's still going to be problems in getting to the whole like miracle point.
But you can. What you're saying is that you can attribute a different source to the neutrons.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah. People have done that and stuff, but
right.
I will find out. I will.
Even other than you said the volcano thing, right? But what I was saying is, well, there's an option that isn't the whatever earthquake. Sorry. You know, there's another option which is just to say unspecified natural process that we don't know about, and there's plenty of them, right? There's a lot of active science research.
But sorry, I want to come back, Dale, to before, because I have some more points that I want to raise about some of the things that Nathan said. But I want you to finish your line of thought first, because you were saying that, look, there's this, I don't accept that there's a gradient, but I do accept that there's a difference between the dating points, right, between Oxford and the others. And you've said one possible hypothesis to explain that is a difference in cleaning procedures. Another hypothesis is this neutron emission hypothesis. And your claim was that absent further considerations, they're both sort of equally or similarly plausible. But then you were about to say that there's an additional consideration that you would want to raise. So I'm curious as to what that was.
Yeah, so there's actually two, right? And so the first one is the carbon-14 dating of something called the Sudarium of Oviedo that you guys didn't really talk about, but you did briefly mention it in your show. So assuming that it's true that these two cloths are linked, the Sudarium gave us a carbon-14 date. There was about 3 valid datings. There was a 4th one that didn't count. But they were all in and around 700 AD. So if they are linked, this is another data point that wouldn't be explained by your hypothesis. But coincidentally, it is plausibly explained by Bob's MCMP calculations. And the reason I say plausibly is because he's just saying, well, if the Shroud was right here on this side bench, it would yield a date of 700 AD if it was, well, what if it was 5 centimeters to the right or to the left and stuff like that? But so that's
this point is like, so given this explanation of the radiation dating, it not only explains very well like a gradient between the different points that kind of goes out, but also it explains this other cloth and why it dates when it does. Is that because that cloth would have been placed underneath or something, or so it's more exposed to radiation, or what's the story there?
So it would have been placed. I wish I could show you guys, but it would have been placed on the side bench, just like the Gospel of John tells us it was placed to the side. And according to the MCMP calculations, there is a 700 AD date, and surrounding that area on the left bench, assuming a Jerusalem-like tomb. He made assumptions as to what his tomb was based on Jewish archaeology.
Well, the thing is that if you connect this then to like a mathematical model, right? So in a mathematical model of what he's doing here, there's basically a value of the amount of dating that you would expect for something being affected by neutron radiation at various distances. And the problem is that this is affording him then in his hypothesis infinite degrees of freedom, basically. So he can go, well, here's how it explains the Sudarium. I can place it at some point and give it the date that we got through dating. And he's able to just like speculate exactly where that is, but he could do that anyway. So I don't think this is maybe as good as Well,
Yeah, he
if
needs to make
that's
the
right,
additional assumption that the cloth was placed at that location, which doesn't seem to me that. So what it explains is exactly what he has to assume, that it was placed at the location that gives it the date. So that's not very convincing to me.
well, you say, why is it at that location? You say, well, because it
Yeah,
fits with
he needs to make that
yeah.
additional assumption in order for that to
Independently,
work.
yeah.
Okay, I would agree mostly, but also it's not infinite amount of things, right? So he could have gotten 700 AD on the ceiling. It couldn't have plausibly been on the ceiling. So there are a limited number of plausible locations.
Well, I guess the problem is here that we don't. What I'm saying is we don't have like an independent reason to think a number of things. That there's a particular spatial dimension to the tomb. Like maybe the tomb is only, I don't know, 2 meters by 1 meter. I don't know. Like this is just speculative. And then he's saying, but it was placed, 3 meters to the right or something. And it's like, well, that would be impossible in that case. And so the point is that when you ask the question, why think that the Sidarium was placed there at that location, the answer that you get is because it's needed to make sense of this data, right? But you actually don't know. Like maybe the Sidarium was in fact placed 50 centimeters away, and then if you make the prediction putting 50 centimeters as a parameter into his neutron model, you'd get a different date that should come out. So it's completely inconsistent. So the point is that I don't think this Sidarium is actually doing the work in this. I mean, maybe what I'd find more convincing is if we knew it was placed over the head or something, like as well as the shroud. And so you had like, a very small degree of freedom, like maybe a few millimeters or something like that. And you're explaining it in terms of stuff being absorbed by one layer of linen and then like something like that. I mean, it's still not going to be good enough because you've got the kind of problem of the priors. So even if that was the case, like the priors so low, but that would be better than this kind of like moving it anywhere within a sort of like reasonably sized space.
Yeah. So I agree that there are degrees of freedom. I disagree with you that it's as free as you're wanting to make it seem, because there are certain data that restrict it. For example, the Gospel of John, right? So if it's inconsistent, if it's on his head underneath the shroud, well, if you don't go for biblical inerrancy, maybe that's not a problem. But then
maybe think about this with that piece of cloth, right? If it's supposed to be uniformly affected by the radiation, but it's placed on like a flat plane with Jesus' body, like what's the radiation doing? Like, does it hit the side of it? Like what, or is it like suspended in the air like this so it hits even? Like again, there's all these kind of details that I'm not sure.
Certain variables, yeah, and there are, when we get to image formation, there are differences in how people understand the radiation. So Bob Rucker is one who I think has argued convincingly. You can tell I'm a fan of his work, but I think he's conclusively refuted the cloth collapse notion or something. So I do think that it.
What's that? Sorry, just for I'm not familiar with the terminology.
So John Jackson, who was the head of STIRP, right? You guys played his video clip against the invisible reweave. He posited ultraviolet radiation as a burst at the time of Jesus' resurrection, but instead of positing a burst of radiation from the body to the cloth vertically, he said the body went mechanically transparent. This left a vacuum and
wait, what? Sorry, mechanically? I don't even know what this means. Mechanically transparent.
It's a made up term. Basically, it's just saying you know how Jesus can walk through physical walls and doors. So
I guess I don't have a good sort of like theory of mechanical transparency and what that means in terms of physics. It sounds like it's the sort of device that just does exactly what it needs to do to produce the data with a very peculiar explanation.
It's a supernatural, non well-defined physically thing, because
but when you say it's a supernatural explanation, you have to say, I don't think that helps you, because you say, why is that supernatural explanation this way rather than any other way it could be? Like, why does it causally interact in this specific way is what I want to know. And I don't think that there's really an answer there, right, other than it just does, which is kind of a very, like, that's the ultimate ad hoc move. Okay, maybe there's an independent reason. Yeah.
This shocked me. Well, yeah. If you want to get into miracles, I will just say, look. So in terms of adjudicating God's motives, when I try to have criteria for identifying miracles, I really like Bill Dembski's specified complexity criteria for detecting intelligent design, because I think miracles, they're events designed by God for a specified purpose, right? So there is the issue of, okay, is the event complex in the sense that it's improbable to occur given natural mechanisms, blah, blah, blah. We can argue on that front. I have various ways for establishing the complexity or the extraordinariness of the event. But then we also need this specificity, the religious context. And that's where I think it's game over with the priors, where it's not ad hoc. The prior probability is 50-50.
Wait, you're saying the prior probability of a mechanical invisibility radiation inducing event is 0.5?
I think so, yeah, because...
What? How is that? How?
Right,
like, how?
Yeah, because so I think the mistake that you're making from what I heard, I think, is you're giving this almost like a frequentist probability of like, okay, well, God could have done it way 1, way 2, way 3, way... No, you're not doing that? Or
no. I'm just thinking, like, of all the things I can imagine God doing, how do I...
Yeah, but Nathan... Strictly speaking, under Bayesian approaches, he can give the prior, he can make the prior anything like, right?
I agree.
The approach that you're advocating would be something like, consider all of the possible ways that God could have done whatever this is. I've kind of lost track of exactly what this is supposed to be accounting for, but however many different ways he could have done it, which is presumably a lot because he's God, right? And then using a principle of indifference type of argument, assign them equal priors, absent additional considerations, right? Now, I think that's a reasonable approach. This sort of approach is taken, for example, in the fine-tuning argument. Now, I think that So I'd be interested to hear why we should effectively give all of those other supernatural possibilities a 0 prior, because that's very surprising to me.
Well, wouldn't all those other ways it would be 0.5, like in the Bayesian sense, 50% plugged into the prior does not affect...
Well, they need to sum to 1, so we're going to have an issue if they all get 0.5, unless we're conditioning on different information each time, but the point is it's supposed to be prior to... the observations we're making. So they can't all get 0.5. All of the different possibilities of whatever the event we're talking about, the priors of those need to sum to 1.
Yeah, so that's correct. So I use a simplistic, I call it a Bayesish method. So it's not Bayesian technically that I am using. It's much more simplistic and much more intuitive, right? So the way I do it, there's only 2 hypotheses. There's either God did it this way or that God did not do it this way, and I'm saying
I don't think that's true. I think
well,
that
he's just
those
negating
are
it, right? So
yeah, well, those are logically exhaustive, but the problem is that one of those is a catch-all hypothesis.
Yes.
So either God did it this way. It's like saying today either I
won the lottery or I didn't win the lottery.
Yeah,
50-50.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
No,
but actually,
not 50-50.
Yeah,
Fair
exactly.
Enough. Okay. Now the other thing I wanted to say though as well is about that context, right? Where God's motive, it's based on, okay, God exists. I'm assuming I've proven that work. Without that, it's going to be lower for sure. And also in terms of the question of divine psychology, because it's a free will choice, right? So does God have the motivation to do this miracle this particular way or not? Which, okay, maybe that's the catch-all. That's what I think is appropriate when we're studying free will choices. It is 50-50. I'm a libertarian.
Why though? Sorry. Like, so what? Why? So think about would you conceptualize God as like a perfect being or something else? Like
a real maximally great being, Eugene Nagasawa's definition. So yeah,
great, right.
And
so if you think about a maximally great being, why do they want to do invisible mechanics that produces neutron radiation on a piece of cloth 13 billion years into a physical carbon-based universe? Think of the maximal being and all of the stuff they could do, right? They could just be perfect forever. They could enjoy platonic form universes. They could enjoy the most amazing dreams and stories that humans have in their head. They could actualize and live out all of those things. And of all of those things, you're saying that it's as likely of all of those happening. It's actually radically more likely. It takes up 50% of the space that they would do this to a blanket with this specific causal mechanism. Not they would produce that image by some other means. They just put it there with no kind of like neutron radiation or cause. Not that they just pop it into existence at the time of the shroud, but they would actually use that causal mechanism as well. Like, why?
So okay, so I have again, it's not it's not like put in proper standard form or anything, but I have a very rough version of a 11 premise argument as to how I argue Christianity is true, how I came to faith during my. So premise 2 in my argument deals with so God, as a real maximally great being, he is also a libertarian free agent. So he created creation. So like, I argue that he has the motivation. One of them is that as many humans as possible achieve their ultimate purpose in creation, whatever that is. It's unspecified at this point. And so I would argue that God has to do it this way.
But he's not created humans yet, though, has he? If we're just considering the hypothesis, one of the things he could do is create humans. And then within the worlds where he creates humans, one of the things he might desire, and that might be, the vast majority of that space, is make it so they can fulfill their purposes. So the point is that there's two assumptions in there that a maximally great being would create humans, which is going to.
And there's another one too, because I think this is one of the two, at least two, best possible worlds. Right. So there's the God alone world where he just doesn't create. I think that has an equal overall utility value to this world. So this is the other world that has the equal value to God. That's why he has to create this world and do the things that he does. Everything plays, even stuff before human beings.
Well, surely he doesn't have to if he's a libertarian agent, right? He chooses to.
He chooses to, correct. Yeah, he could have chosen not to create. But given he chooses to create, I think I would argue that he has to do everything has to do it the way he did to achieve that result, that end result. Otherwise, we would be living in a lesser world.
So you're saying God can't produce an image without neutron radiation on a cloth?
So in terms of omnipotently speaking, he could. But if he did, that world would have lesser value than this one where he chooses to do the miracle that way.
Well, so what's valuable about neutron radiation?
I find immense value in understanding the mechanisms of how, God did something. So great. He could have done a miracle as just a basic action, right? The supernatural bit is always what philosophers of action call a basic action.
But what you're telling me here, though, is you find value in learning about these things, and I don't dispute that. But it sounds like the thing, what is it specifically about learning about neutron radiation that's more valuable than learning about some other, causal mechanism that someone could come up with? Because you could specify an even more complicated or something that why is it neutron radiation specifically that's so the most interesting thing to find out about? And neutron radiation in 2000, in 1 AD or whatever.
Yeah. So again, speaking from a Christian theism perspective, if you can allow me for a second, right? So
sure.
What is our ultimate purpose? It's Christian salvation, right? It's being in that eternal loving relationship with God for all eternity and stuff like that, and having as many free will creatures, because free will is required on our parts to enter that state once we've chosen to fall. Being in that state, as many free will creatures choosing to be in that end state as possible. And I know personally, myself, as well as many others, where this kind of evidence played a role, being able to detect and explain how radiation, neutron and stuff like that, explain the images that we have, as well as accounting for the carbon-14 dating that would otherwise suggest it's a fake. That leads people to believe and go, yeah, actually.
But the thing is, how many people do you think have been brought to Christ specifically because of the neutron hypothesis about the Shroud of Turin? Be honest.
Specifically,
because that's what we're talking about now.
Okay, well, but don't forget it.
I think it's zero.
The neutron hypothesis alone. It's everything combined. For me,
but
it's
no, it's not though, because Nathan was asking specifically about God's reasons for using neutrons, and you said it's a way for God to communicate to us through like learning about it and understanding it, his existence, and that there's value in that and bringing people to Christ, right? But it seems to me that maybe other apologetic arguments or other ways that we can come to know God have done that, but I really don't think the neutron hypothesis about the Shroud of Turin has done that to anyone. So that just seems very implausible to me.
Well, I don't know. People, when it comes to free will, I see it as a black box, and people are, myself included, at times react very stupidly and non-rationally at times.
What do you mean there, though? Sorry, when you say you see free will as a black box, you're saying it's difficult to people can do what they want libertarianly or something. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like it's not predetermined, right? So I mean, we have very difficulty understanding how even one choice.
But you can make an epistemic prediction still, right? So suppose libertarian free will is true, and you have libertarian free will. Yeah. I have 99% certainty that you will, of your libertarian free will, talk about the Shroud of Turin in the next hour, right? Now, how can I make that? Like, that doesn't undermine the fact that you have free will. It's because I'm making an epistemic claim based on the evidence that I have. And so, even in the case of God, like, yeah, God can have libertarian free will, but we can make an epistemic claim based on what we have reason to think God would do, and attribute, and make statistical predictions about what we think, God would do, just purely on the hypothesis. I mean, that's what, like, when you're talking about basic actions, I think you're appealing to someone like Swinburne there. And that's precisely what he tries to do. For example, like a lot of Christian philosophers who are, they're trying to do that sort of thing, right? They don't think that libertarian free will undermines their ability to make the epistemic attribution.
So I totally agree with what you're saying, but by the same token, you would also have to agree with me that those abilities to make accurate predictions of that sort are very limited. So, for example, can you predict right now, based on my choice to speak about the Shroud for the next hour, how many audience members are going to choose to leave a supportive comment versus a negative comment? Don't say the number out loud, just put it in your head and let's count it. Can you predict those free choices based on my free choice? We're very limited in the...
Yeah, not very well. But then I think that this isn't going to really help your case either, right? Because if you're saying that it's too complicated for us to be able to sort of like be very confident in saying what God would predict, well, that's going to undermine your ability to say that it predicts this very well, because you're saying we actually, the nature of God is so sort of mysterious and bizarre, or so many degrees of freedom, we can't say what with any degree of certainty what he would or wouldn't do. And then then one of the things that we can't say he would or wouldn't do is produce neutron radiation.
Well, here's how I would respond to that, right? So I think that we can, both through divine revelation as a Christian theist, or even without that, as just a general theist, and arguing that God's a libertarian free will agent who chose to create either directly or indirectly us. He had a reason, right? This is the rationality condition for freedom. He had a reason for creating us, whatever that is. So I actually have independent reasons for getting inside God's head without specificity of saying, well, he had a reason. So as a real maximally great being, he will see to it that that reason is achieved. And whatever happens is playing into that role over the great.
I think the problem with what you're doing, though, when you do this, is that you're reasoning hypothetically, right? You're saying, if this is correct, then God would have had a reason. And I think when you recognize that, then you have to say, well, that's like one model among many kind of consistent models. And then we talk about like how we should proportion our beliefs in total without just kind of like, drawing the circle around what we want. And it's going to turn out that there's a lot of different reasons God could have had, and a lot of different ways of making sense of the data based off of those like imagined different reasons and things. And one very narrow way of things being is that God specifically has that reason, right? Another thing.
What was the hypothetical bit though? Because I'm confused on that. I don't think...
So I think, tell me if this is wrong, that you're saying something like, look, if God exists and he did all this, and my theory about like God's not irrational, so God would have had a reason for doing. If you know, it's like if God caused the Shroud of Turin image on Jesus's resurrection cloth, Jesus' burial cloth, using radiocarbon dating, then he would have had a reason to do that, right? Is what you're saying?
So I guess I'm saying if for conversation's sake here. But look, it's a fact. The Shroud of Turin's images exist. The Shroud of Turin has been carbon dated, and these are the results we got. These are facts. So this isn't.
Yeah, that's right. But what you're saying is, if my explanation is right, then God would have had a reason for doing that.
Oh, yeah. So that's where I would provide the warrant for things like my prior premises in the argument, because I would argue God has a reason for everything that occurs. Not just the Shroud of Turin.
I mean, I think this is right on maximal being theism, because he's only going to sort of like act in accordance with what he has reason to do. But then this is where we get into the question of priors, right? Because what you're doing, this is where I said like drawing, a circle around what you hit, because you're saying he did have those reasons because my explanation is true. But what we're trying to do is establish whether or not we should think the explanation is true. And in order to do that, we're thinking of all the possible reasons God could have and what differences they would lead to see if it predicts this explanation well or not. Does that make sense?
Kind of. It seems wrong, though, to me, to take this frequentist approach, because this is a
Bayesian approach, 100% Bayesian approach.
The issue is how to come up with priors for this. So remember, the hypothesis is that we can explain the gradation of dating through a neutron emission hypothesis. We then need to consider what's the prior probability, that is prior to observing the shroud, or prior to observing the dating of the shroud, I guess. What is the probability that God would use this mechanism? So Bayesian statistics itself doesn't tell you how to get that prior. We need some additional principles to come to that prior. So the idea that it should be accorded a prior of 0.5, as I've argued, Nathan and I have argued, seems very implausible, because there seem to be many ways, at least conceptually, that God could have produced an equivalent image, given that God is omnipotent. And so it's unclear why, of all of the possible space, we'd accord half of it to neutron emission. That seems fairly implausible. It would seem more plausible to accord similar portions to a variety of different hypotheses. So that's, I think, where at least I'm getting stuck here.
Okay, so let me. I think I've maybe found a good way to explain why I'm hesitant with what you guys are saying. So here's an analogy, right? So let's say we have data, we hear hoofbeats, right? And we have a total of 3 options. So it was either a zebra, a donkey, or a horse. So therefore we say, oh, well, there's 3 options. So the prior probability is 1/3. It's not 50%. That's ridiculous. It's not 50-50 that it's a horse. It would be 1/3. But that's saying that the prior probability, and then if we add a 4th thing that has hoofbeats, I can't think of something right now, a cow or something like that. Oh, so now suddenly the prior probability is 1/4. Well, that it was a horse. Well, what we're doing here is we're asking what's the prior probability that is a horse, just as a random guess, right? So randomly, I'm hearing hoofbeats. What's the prior prob that it would be a zebra or a horse? In that case, yeah, it is these 1/4 or 1/3, whatever number of options. But I don't think that's what we're saying. We're not saying that God is up there in heaven saying, I have all these infinite ways to create shroud images. I'm going to pick neutron absorption. There we go. You're the lucky winner.
Oh, no. Yeah, he doesn't have to be.
You're looking at it the wrong way. The question is not, is God picking between these? The question is, we have to figure out what God wanted to do, and we don't know. So we can't see a reason why he would prefer neutrons over any of the other possibilities, and so therefore we accord them equal weight. It's not God is picking randomly between them. It's we are according them equal weight in our judgment because we can't see a difference between them, at least at this stage, like before considering the dating evidence. So that's how Bayesian approaches work, because it's an epistemic probability based on our knowledge. It's not a statement about like mechanisms in the world that produce outcomes. It might have been certain from God's point of view that he would always do it this one way, but we don't know that if we can't see the reasons.
Okay, yeah. So this will be my last thing on this, because I did have one other thing on the carbon-14, but
Yeah,
I love this conversation, by the way. So I think that the issue is, even from our perspective on an epistemic level, we do have some knowledge as to reasons, right? Like the thing is, does everything that happens, including neutron irradiation on the Shroud, happen providentially for a real maximum great being to achieve his purpose or not? And that is...
Yeah, I sort of think not. I think under that hypothesis, it's sort of doing quite a bad job, right? Because there's a lot of other things that I can think of that would much better achieve those goals. But I think, so to try and like steelman maybe what you're saying, I think it's something like, well, we're not going from just the hypothesis of like a maximally great being. You're saying like there's this other stuff that we can update on. You've not explicitly said this, but maybe it's like, you know, the fact that we know humans exist already. And so, you know, or maybe there's like a contingency argument, maybe there's a fine tuning, like there's all this stuff that we can kind of like layer in. So we should be in a position of affording God with some characteristics, if we're in your shoes, right, like a higher prior than just like a principle of indifference or something, because we've kind of got there through a bunch of other things that we've thought about. And I think even if we sort of grant that, a lot of the same problems remain, right? Because if I imagine I'm in this space where like, okay, contingency argument is right, fine-tuning argument is right. You know, God cares about morally valuable agents, and he can only achieve that. He can only achieve certain kinds of goods he cares about through our moral interactions in embodied, as embodied carbon-based agents and all that stuff. And we get to our planet. Okay, so we're there. I'm 90% confident this kind of God exists and that they care about our physical interactions and stuff. Well, like, here's the thing. Which religion are they going to set up? I don't know. How are they going to set up that religion? I think at that point, that's where, you know, the types of things that people appeal to, like writing made by God in the sky or something like that, right, becomes much more sort of, or like, why not Jesus now? Why not Jesus all the time? Like just physically there to answer these questions, like you can answer my questions, or what? For me, these get like, even if we've established all of that stuff, that's a far bigger portion of what I think God's going to do to achieve those sorts of goals that we think he has, than a burst of neutron radiation on like a shroud a few thousand years ago with like highly opaque kind of like evidence around it in other aspects, you know.
Fair enough. Yeah. I promised. Yeah, that would be the last word on that for me. But you understand the way I see it is it's all the same, right? Everything that happens, whether it's that, they're all the same in terms of God's providence, aiming towards that goal, which I'm assuming I've proved in the premise 1 and 2 of my argument and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, maybe I can take a look at that, but I think what I've said will probably still apply. But yeah, if you want to get back to then the carbon dating, and
absolutely,
we can go through the rest of it.
Yeah. If you guys want, I'll come back and we can go over the argument and that. But okay,
sure.
In terms of the carbon dating, I was looking for a specific thing I wanted to show you. So here's something that I think is the strongest evidence supporting neutron absorption is it. The natural explanation cannot explain this data. And this was something published in Applied Optics by a friend of mine, Dr. Thomas McAvoy. And I wish I could find the graph. Okay, so I'll just have to tell you about it. But basically what he did, he looked at the STIRP ultraviolet fluorescence studies. And he compared the graph that he got, the ultraviolet fluorescence intensity, and it came up with an exact duplicate of the double-pointed graph of Bob's MC NP calculations. So that it would be so much better if I was able to find it and show you guys.
If you can, like feel free to share screen. By the way, I should have said before. Like, obviously, we can do that.
Oh well, yeah. Also, yeah, I wasn't sure if I was allowed to.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so let me. Come on. Oh, getting to it. Okay, here we go. I got it. All right, so share screen. Is that popping up?
Yeah, it should do.
Actually, I can just play a couple minutes to have him explain. Okay.
And if you compare areas, you find out that the dorsal intensity is always higher than the frontal intensity. And the difference can be as much as 10, the fluorescence intensity units, difference of 10. And I thought, wow, that's really strange. What would cause this type of behavior? And I published this in Applied Optics. Now, here's a slide that summarizes what I had found. Again, data from the Shroud. The UV fluorescence intensity is highest at the midsection of the center of the dorsal image. And that's the green image on the left is the dorsal image. And that's the highest value of any of them. The fluorescence intensity is higher on the dorsal image than the frontal. And this means you compare feet to feet, and then maybe the knee to the knee, and torso to the torso, etc. And then the fluorescence intensity is higher on the top side of the image than the bottom side of the image. And so the question I had after getting these results is what could cause these unique fluorescence properties of the Shroud itself? And I mentioned that Phillips had hypothesized that neutron radiation arising from the body covered by the Shroud could, one, alter its radiocarbon dating and create long-lived radioactive isotopes of chlorine and calcium in the Shroud. It does not account for the image formation. Okay? And it's just a very brief, it's almost like one-page letter to the editor. I became familiar with, and I've actually interacted with Bob Rucker and what he did, and he published this in 2014 and is working on it, and has worked on it since. But he simulated neutron radiation. He actually simulated Phillips' hypothesis. And his main assumption is that, in the simulation, is that the thermal neutrons were emitted homogeneously, or uniformly, if you will, from within the body and isotropically, or uniformly, in all directions. And the simulation then calculated radiocarbon dates for various points on the Shroud. And he has here, there are two schematics I've taken from Bob's papers. One shows how the body in the Shroud was laid out, the top one, and then the bottom one shows his model of the tomb. And you can see that to the right of the body, there's a wall, to the left there's empty space. And he had this code that I believe he had worked on when he was at the lab out in Washington, that he used for his simulations, and he ran a bunch of Monte Carlo simulations. Okay. And here's what he got in terms of his radiocarbon dating. And this is now down the center. He had results down the whole Shroud. I'm just showing the center image here. And if you look at the circle, you can see that comes from the area of the Shroud that was actually radiocarbon dated. And you can see there's a pretty significant gradient there. And we saw when we looked at the numbers, it was about 90 years per inch. So there's a pretty steep gradient over there. And as you get closer to the center of the Shroud, then it becomes younger and younger and younger. And eventually you wind up having it date to the future. But these are his results. And the x-axis or the y-axis here are the radiocarbon dates that he's calculating. When I plot my UV results, and again, the UV are results from the Shroud, I was amazed. I got the same type of curve.
Okay, so I think you guys kind of get it, right? Like there is this correspondence of the ultraviolet fluorescence. This is real empirical data from the Shroud itself. And Bob's independently obtained graph of the MCMP calculations. So I think this correspondence is supporting empirical evidence that neutron hypothesis is more probable compared to the natural alternative of Brian Walsh and some kind of anomalous cleaning procedure at Oxford.
So I have a couple of questions about what I just heard in that video there, because I've been trying to, while we've been talking, I've been trying to look around to understand this neutron hypothesis a little better. Can I share here?
Yeah. I think you also have permissions to, I think you could even end the stream if you wanted to. Do you see the button, James, if you wanted to?
Is that a hit?
Well, Nathan, when I say can,
I just don't know. I don't think you can.
When I say can I, that's a polite way of saying I'm going to. All right. So this is just one of these. Rucker has written a lot of papers about this. So I'm not sure if I'm referencing the right one. I'm just showing you which one I'm looking at here. So from 2020. I was just looking at this diagram here. The general form of the shape matches what we were shown, but the details don't. So I'm not entirely sure if this was a slightly different version of the simulation or something. Because I mean, this version doesn't match nearly as well as the one that we just saw there. So that's an immediate question I have as to what we're looking at exactly.
Yeah, but here's the Ptolemaic epicycle, is that the central torso area emits more radiation. In fact, specifically just the amount required to produce that curve.
Well, I have a bunch of other things that I want to say as well, which if we can just put those on pause. But this is something that struck me immediately because I just want to make sure we're even talking about the same thing, because this graph doesn't match. So do you have an is this a different version, or is it plotted differently here?
So yeah, I think so Tom McAvoy was using Bob's 2014 calculations. I
couldn't find a reference to that on the site that I'm looking at. The papers only go back to 2016.
Yeah, he didn't even have a website prior to that. And that was when he was just kind of getting into the Shroud of Turin and stuff like that. So, but yeah, there have been updates and stuff like that. I think Tom also mentioned that he was looking at, didn't he mention the center portion as well or something?
Well, the center of mass is here, right?
And right. I'm right in thinking that these are, if the theory is right, the carbon-14 dates that it would predict if it was a first century. Yeah. So these are actually testable hypotheses, right? Which is great.
Falsifiable. Yeah.
Well, hang on. So, but the neutron hypothesis is not falsifiable based on the dating method, because based on what he says here, it's very clear that he assumes that the amount of neutron radiation that's produced, he just assumes that it must be such that he gets the right carbon dating. So it's calibrated.
Well, that he could modify. Yeah. Well, this is the problem.
So it has that free parameter there, because he has to assume how much neutron radiation was emitted. That's a question I had. He explains it very clearly here that he's calibrated the amount such that you get the right date based on the location that was carbon dated. I'm not sure which end it was here.
Those are inputs, obviously.
Yes.
Yeah.
But all I'm saying is you can't test that because it's calibrated to match the observed carbon data.
Well. So
unless you did another carbon date and that showed
areas, we have threads that have been removed from other areas, so they're already off the Shroud. Yeah. We don't have to touch the Shroud or damage the Shroud.
Oh, the testing here is what you meant. Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, I misunderstood.
I don't know if it's from the center, but it's from.
Yeah, sorry, that's what I was saying. Is like where you've got this curve. If you make predictions,
I misunderstood what you meant in that area.
But you're right, though. You're right. There are free parameters. You could still, for example, suppose you got like a really jagged carbon dating line or something. We could say, look, that's how God does the neutron radiation. He loves changing it up every centimeter along or something, right? Like you could do that with these.
Once you're talking supernatural, you could, but obviously the benefit of Bob's model is once that initial supernatural act takes over, it's all explainable through the laws of physics. Well, so
I don't know. So because for example, like when you look at the curve on that diagram. Sorry if you're trying to read something, James, but
I'm just trying to find something else. But
the way that the curve changes in proportion to the body as well. What's the theoretical basis for why you get different amounts of radiation out of bits of the body? I mean, it seems to sort of maybe approximately correspond to density or size, but if there is some theoretical basis underlying here, what are the actual numbers
Well,
here. And
that's the next thing that I was able to wanted to raise, because I can't find any details of how he did the simulation. It seems that the assumption he made was that the radiation was emitted. What's the word I'm looking for? That it was the same for each mass unit of the body. And so that's going to account for different amounts of radiation, say, at the feet compared to at the torso.
But you can modify the body size infinitely, because you don't
not
have...
infinitely, because that's based on the image on the shroud, right? So you can have it does depend on a bit how the posture that the body is in.
Because you could end up with...
shape, yeah.
Well, what I mean is, like mathematically speaking, you could end up with a body shape that was like completely contorted and disproportional to a human body, and just say, well, God must have morphed his body into that shape if some other part of the theory showed that.
Well, that's why I want to know exactly what shape he was assuming the body took in the simulation. Assuming that it's this shape shown here, which is based on the positioning in the shroud, then you would get an estimate of how much radiation would be emitted at each point based on the mass at that region. I'd really like to see the details of how that was constructed, but I can't find that. And so that's kind of a red flag to me, because I don't know why he would not put... Maybe that information is on the website. There's a lot on the website, but I can't find it anywhere.
I think it is on his more recent... It might be in his more recent papers. But he's actually gone beyond that from 2020. He's gone way beyond this, where he's actually calculating something that will actually falsify based on the subsample data. I have no idea what it is. I couldn't explain it, but he said it will once and for all falsify with the data, just the carbon dating data we have. And he is working on getting that paper published for the journal Nature. So
let's importantly note, it will falsify. It would... potentially, if everything that's said here is right, would falsify the neutron radiation hypothesis. It will not falsify alternative speculations about...
I have another issue that I wanted to raise that I just...
One last thing, sorry, James, to interrupt, but
go ahead.
Another thing with that curve, the reason there could be a difference is the one that Dr. Tom McAvoy was showing included the dorsal and then the frontal image. That the thing you were looking at was just the frontal image, so that may be why the curve is different.
But without further explication of what exactly, because you've said that he's done, Rucker has done lots of different versions of this. So if one version matches but others don't, that's really hard for me to say much about why that might be the case. I just need a bit more detail as to why we're seeing certain shapes in certain cases. Another thing that I wanted to say is that the hypothesis of Rucker's simulations, as I understand it, is, as I said, that there's radiation emitted proportional to the amount of mass in a given distance along the body. Like there's more in the torso than in the feet, right? And that accounts for different amounts of neutron at different points on the shroud, which in turn account for different dates. Now, I don't know what the basis of that curve of the UV is. Like, I don't know what is the origin of the ultraviolet, what was it again? Fluorescence. I don't know what causes that, but if it is due to any, if the fluorescence is due to some effect on the cloth, which in turn is related to the cloth's image or how it was produced by contact with a body at some point in history, then it's conceivable that amount of contact was proportional to the surface area or even the mass of the body. So, for example, if there's some pigment that was at one point applied to the cloth, maybe the pigment is now washed off. But if that's had some chemical, if that had a chemical interaction with the fibers on the shroud, which is what I would hypothesize is the basis of the image formation, that may be the cause of the ultraviolet fluorescence. If so, then the amount of contact with that region of the body would account for the amount of fluorescence that we see, which in turn would lead to less at the feet and the head than in the torso. So you would see this kind of U-shape, right? So it's not obvious that this actually distinguishes between the hypotheses. If anything, if any process that leads to more in the middle and less at the sides is all we need here, then any image formation process that led to the cloth at some point being in contact with the body would seemingly account for that general shape. Did you see what I'm saying?
I do, but I don't think that would work in the specificity.
Well, why not?
Like when we're talking
well, we don't know the specificity. Like, we don't have any details about which version of the curve we're even looking at in the Rucker case, or why we're seeing this UV curve. Like, I don't know what the chemical basis of that is. So without more detail, we don't really have very much specificity. And until someone has demonstrated that until someone has compared to a rival hypothesis to see, well, could we get this curve in another means? I don't really think we have much here, to be honest. Like Rucker already had two very different curves. All that was in common between them was that there was more at the center than at the edges. That crude level, at least, seems quite possible to explicate under alternate hypotheses. And until someone's looked at that in more detail, I regard this evidence as very unconvincing.
Okay, well, yeah, like I said, the curve that you looked at was just the frontal image, whereas the one Thomas McAvoy was the dorsal and the frontal combined for the whole.
But that makes even less sense because they only had one curve in each case. Like that was lower at each end and higher in the middle. But it would seem that so how can you have the same shape over half of the shroud versus over the whole shroud? Wouldn't it be, because if it was over the whole shroud, the dorsal and the frontal, there should be two curves, right? One corresponding to a peak where the torso was.
You're talking about on the paper of Bob's, it should have the double peak.
Okay, let me, maybe it's
because that's just the frontal, right? The dorsal isn't even.
That's what I'm saying. That doesn't make sense to me. Hang on, let me just pull up the.
Or maybe it's
clear what I'm saying here. Where's it gone? It's disappeared on me. Where's the tab? Sorry.
Nathan's getting worried. He's like, okay, let's move on.
No, it's just someone with trying to brain rot me in the comments.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so this is what Ruck is showing here, right?
Yeah.
So this is clearly just the frontal image.
Whereas the thing I had was the dorsal, I think.
Was both together, right? The dorsal and the frontal images. But then that's not consistent. Like, how can it have both shapes? How can the same shape be visible across the whole shroud versus half of the shroud? That's not just a difference in detail. That's a fundamentally different shape.
Yeah, so I guess I've linked to the applied optics paper. I don't have the answer offhand, but I'm sure it is explained in the paper. So I have actually linked to that applied optics paper. So if you guys maybe read it and then.
Yeah, I can have a look at that, but you see, it's a bit hard for me to assess a hypothesis when I'm told that, like, oh, there's different versions of the simulation, and I don't know actually which one's being referred to. That's really difficult to do anything with.
Yeah, even the test, there's a lot of, like I was thinking as you were playing that video, like even the sort of like measurements that he's taken, I don't understand the measurement process to understand what that would be a measure of. I don't know a lot about, like, it's just not my field at all. So I don't know about like the types of causes and degradation processes I should expect in linen, like I don't know about light and its interaction with different pigments and linens and things. So there's just like so many assumptions where I feel like I'd really have to be an expert in all of this stuff to be able to look at someone giving me a kind of like TLDR like that and say, wow, that's really impressive.
At this point, what I have is someone telling me that we should believe a certain hypothesis because two curves match, when I don't have any details about why these curves,
that's a good way of putting
are
it.
arrived at. Yeah. And there are two different versions of one of the curves. And also, I don't know whether this curve would be expected under other hypotheses. I just thought of a reason where it seems plausible that if you can explain this curve in terms of the amount of material that's in contact with the body and any chemical process that generates the UV fluorescence, that maybe we would expect this curve under alternate hypotheses. You also need to consider that. You can't say that something is evidence for one hypothesis if you would expect to see it under all hypotheses. And so because we don't have any of these details, I can't really assess this evidence.
So I agree with your assessment that we should be open to alternative hypotheses. All we've done, they have established empirically that neutrons would affect ultraviolet fluorescence. That's in the paper itself. They've done the empirical experiments, but
possibly. I mean, I actually don't. The problem is maybe they have done that in the paper, but like the thing is, I don't know that. Like maybe the paper is like, a lot of these papers are published in like predatory journals, for example, is a theme I've come across.
So that's...
Well, I don't know. Well, I don't know. I don't know about that journal, but at least like the Fanti papers were in predatory journals with basically like they accept low quality papers, very, very frequently. And when he has published in higher quality paper journals, what he said has been retracted, right? And so there are issues with it's not even like I'm like 50-50 on this. Like I lean towards it's probably going to turn out that there's something weird at the bottom of this at this point because there's like this pattern when I'm engaging in this topic.
Well,
now,
again, found this maybe weird. There's two different curves on the rocket. So we already don't have an explanation for that. That's a huge issue as far as I'm concerned. Which is it?
and just because my personal failing, like I'm not a nuclear engineer or a physicist like Tom. So don't assume that my failure to give an explanation means there isn't one. So
right, but it doesn't mean that we should think there is one.
There is one either.
Yeah.
well, let me ask this then. So given, once again, with the carbon dating, I know we spent 2 hours on two segments, but you guys do have the burden of proof here. Would you guys at least, given there's so much you guys don't know,
But for what claim?
should
Sorry,
you withhold judgment until you read the papers to see if there is that explanation?
I don't think so, because basically we have high quality journals using a well attested method with a good theoretical basis, giving us some good data where for the problems that there are, for some statistical issues that there are with the data, there's a good causal explanation that we know is true that accounts for the differences that we see, right? So overall, even if, even with those problems, we should have, I think, somewhere above 90% credence towards it being somewhere in that range, right? Not being first century. So like, for example, those dates being produced due to neutron radiation or something, I agree, I'm not ruling it out, but I as an agent give that maybe something like, I can't really assess it, but to give like a ballpark figure, like 0.0000. Well, what I'm saying is, well, I think you're referring to a frequentist statistical test when you say 68%. Like, what I think you're referring to various things like confidence intervals, or the probability that this distribution was produced by a particular set of parameters that are being assumed, which is not the same as an agentic credence. So, like earlier in the conversation where you were saying you're assuming like frequentism, I actually think that you've been using the language of frequentist statistics to then use that as Bayesian like credences at certain points. When I talk about my credence as an agent, I'm saying towards that explanation, it's somewhere in the range of 0. Like it's so, I can't give a number, but it's like really, really, really small. And that's after, taking into account like the carbon dating, right? That it's in that the correct date is in that region. So yeah, I don't think that there are problems here. I don't know, like we've got a reputable journal, really good theoretical basis for a method that was done fairly well. Yes, it could have been better, but it's still really good. I don't see why I should doubt that. Like, it's like you're kind of saying
applied optics is on the same level as nature. So like, I'm surprised.
Maybe it is.
It is.
Yeah, maybe it is. Well, I'm not. It's not my field. Why would I have heard of that?
Okay.
Like, an optics journal.
Well, who was the author of the applied optics paper?
Dr. Thomas McAvoy, MC.
Okay, I'm obviously looking at the wrong one. There's another one in applied optics about the shroud.
Yeah, I think he has a couple papers in applied optics. If it's the same guy, you want me to try and find it?
Yeah, if you just throw a link, that'd be cool. But I also wanted to answer your question. So no, I think that the evidence for the shroud having a medieval origin is extremely strong, and the fact that there are some papers that I haven't read on it is not a good reason to doubt that. But I want to sort of throw the question to you in a bit different way, Dale, because I'm curious as to what you think about this. So a few years ago, I debated a Hindu gentleman who was arguing that some of the Puranic texts, which are ancient Hindu texts, provided calculations for the origin, or they provided dates that could be used to calculate the age of the universe, which corresponded very strongly, like very closely, to those that we have from modern cosmology. Do you know anything about that?
I did study it. I even took a philosophy of religion course where we addressed that specifically. I forget the details.
I find that hard to believe because he originated the argument, and as far as I know, is the only one who's discussed it.
No, like I said, I had a professor talking about how they had these cycles matching long ages, but actually the universe is 14.6 billion years old. This time scale on the Hindu thing of these cycles of the universe are vastly.
Yeah, so you're not talking about what I'm talking about, because this paper specifically, he was arguing that from certain numbers that are given in a certain text that he derived a date of 13.8 billion years or very close to that for the universe. And I think there was one for the solar system as well. So there's a specific paper that he published on this, and I debated him about it. I didn't expect you to have heard of it, right? Like, that isn't the point.
Okay.
The point is I choose it as an obscure thing that I happen to know about because someone contacted me about it. And the question then would be, the fact that you don't know about that, there's no reason you should know about that, right? I'm not faulting you for that. But does that then mean that you should withhold judgment about your religious beliefs or other perspectives because there's some paper that someone's written about an argument that you don't know about?
Yeah, I guess so. No, I would remain agnostic in terms of the specific claim.
But you're not agnostic, though, because this guy claims that it's evidence of the divine inspiration of Hinduism.
Okay. So in that case,
which I don't think you can be agnostic about giving the commitments.
Yeah. So in that case, I would rely on the evidence I am privy to, which is evidence in favor of Christianity counts as negative evidence against Hinduism. So I would have.
There's your answer that I would give about your claims about the shroud.
Fair enough.
Okay. Obviously making the appropriate changes.
All right, cool.
But the point I'm making is that we all do this about, this was just a little example. The point is that we all do this about all the time because we can never assess every single piece of evidence that's been brought to bear. And so we're always going to have to ignore or dismiss some types of evidence without looking at them in detail, unless we're always agnostic about essentially everything all the time. And I mean, maybe there are some people who maybe think that you should be agnostic about pretty much everything all the time, but I don't think that that's the case. And evidently you don't think that's the case either. So I don't think that appeal to, there's a paper you haven't read or a few papers is very convincing. Now, obviously, sometimes that argument should be convincing, like if you don't know anything about a topic, right? I'm not saying that that's never relevant, but it's going to be very contextual as to where that argument goes through in a given case, I would argue.
Fair enough. Yeah, I would just submit that I think in this case, this is a paper that's worthy of, looking.
Yeah, I'm happy to have a look at it. I'm at the moment, I'm trying to find it, but
will find it.
There's something else that I wanted to raise also, if that's okay.
Also, I think I was looking at the right guy's publications on Google Scholar, and it doesn't look like that's exactly within what he normally publishes on as well, which seems kind of odd. But there's so many issues with a lot of this stuff. For most of these papers, I think it's pretty clear that some kind of statistical malpractice has been engaged in, from like data dredging and p-hacking to like other types of things. Again, to get into the specifics of that would require just going into the details of the types of arguments that they're making. But they're often, not engaging in good academic practices around these things, where they would kind of like commit themselves to certain things, like during pre-registration, or laying out, showing us all the things that all the other types of analysis that could be performed and might show something different.
And it's important to understand the baseline is that like most academic research doesn't replicate, because there are so many researcher degrees of freedom and poor practices that are that occur all the time. My baseline is pretty skeptical about reading any arbitrary academic paper, like especially sort of empirical papers. And that's for very like mainstream kind of not religiously associated work, right? And I think my skepticism is even a bit higher there, because there are people who devote their careers to kind of proving these sorts of things, and I do regard that as a little dodgy. So that's a little extra skepticism that I have on top of everything else. And so just the fact that a paper has been published in a prestigious journal is not strong evidence for me. You really need to look into the details.
Like, even when you think about the theoretical basis for the statistical tools that are being used in terms of like, why is that number the right number for a good confidence interval, or a good number for a significance test, right? Well, it's just kind of vibes based at the end of the day. It's like, because I'm okay with rejecting this or that hypothesis if the probability of it being due to chance is below or above some threshold, right, in some case. So like those sorts of things could still not be, they might not be good values for certain types of claims. This is also another thing that's at the bottom of a lot of these like replication issues in the science, is like people doing kind of like cargo cult statistics and just applying statistical tests until they kind of show something that they, until they show some positive effect that they can get published.
Okay, well, so if you're talking about the 95%, like that degree is just kind of international standards. Like I even remember in business school learning about that for quality.
Yeah, and many journals will not accept frequentist statistical tests on papers that they take anymore because of the amount of malpractice that it's introduced.
Okay, fair enough. So, yeah, I
Can
think
I ask about this?
I do have.
Sorry, Dale.
Oh, go ahead. I do have some
Like to
points,
ask
but
about this.
I wanted to move on to the next subject. Are you guys getting into image formation? Or?
I think
well, this is
to be
related
honest,
to that. This is
I probably
Sorry,
want to
Nathan.
go in the next 15 minutes or so as well. If that's so, if there's like a time for, like, maybe we could get to
all
whatever.
right. Never
you
mind
think is
about
most
this then. Let's
important.
just talk about. We should talk at least something about image formation. I think
Okay. So
that's
let's
kind
go
of
with
important.
this, because you guys went for Luigi Garlashelli's hypothesis. You thought that fully explained all the data and stuff like that, right? So
To caveat, I think it does, but I guess I'm pretty agnostic on exactly how the image was produced. I probably like lean towards not sure. I think some kind of pigment was involved. I don't really know, but like definitely some natural process like that.
okay, so I guess I would ask, because again, there was very brief mention, like you guys mentioned, there was studies going back on both sides, and you couldn't make heads or tails of it and stuff like that. So I think you guys just kind of said, well, pigments, it's an option, it's on the table, as far as I know.
That
So
is
I'm-
definitely not what I said about image formation. I said a lot of specific things about what hypothesis I think is most reasonable.
Oh yeah, I got Luigi Garlashelli's and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
well, based on that idea. So the idea is that we know that the image is formed by superficial discoloration of
Linen fibers.
the linen fibers, and the Garlashelli showed that you can produce that effect by applying certain type of pigment. I forget exactly what he applied, and then he with an acid base, which then he put in an oven for a few hours and then washed the pigment off, which produced a similar, not exact, but similar type of discoloration of the pigments. And so something like that process, which involved an initial application of pigment with some chemicals that had an effect on the linen fiber, which was either perhaps baked at the time or possibly just due to the effects of time, whether it was a combination of those, the pigment was mostly removed, flaked off, or handled or washed off. And what was left was the discoloration produced by oxidation of the cellulose molecules in the superficial linen fibers. I think that is the most plausible explanation of the image formation.
Okay, so I would argue it fails. It is true. Through the acidic compounds, it can create, that oxidized cellulose or something like that. Okay, great. That's one thing. Now, in terms of something like body image uniformity, so this is the claim that within plus or minus 2%, each individual fibril is colored with the same intensity of straw yellow coloring. His image forming mechanism would not do that. And in fact, he even presents, I think in the 25-page paper you guys read, there is even a picture showing that there is different intensities of colors on certain portions of the thread. And there's an effect that Walter McCrone was the skeptic who said he's discovered paint on the Shroud in the 1980s. He said that the mechanisms like Garlashelli's will not work because it will produce snow fencing, which is related to that body image uniformity. There's a thing called the snow fencing effect, and you see that on Garlashelli's results that he presents. So it fails. It's not like the Shroud on that front. Same with
what is the effect? Sorry, like I don't think you've established what that is and that it is present. Like it's like kind of like, imagine if I said this, like if neutron radiation happened, you would have the schmuggly wuggly effect, and there is the schmuggly, there isn't the schmuggly wuggly effect. Therefore, the neutron radiation isn't true. Like it doesn't like appealing to these things. We need
it's in relation to how the distribution of the pigment particles would be in terms of the colored fibers and threads and stuff like that. And
how do we know that isn't on the Shroud?
Because they've examined the Shroud spectrally with dozens of spectral instruments, as well as microchemically, using all the same tests that McCrone did, plus additional ones, and it's not there. The effect, even Walter
Dale,
McCrone,
it's impossible for me to assess what you're saying because you're not giving enough detail for me to know what you're talking about. So, for example, you've talked about the idea that What was it
do you
again?
have Oh, sorry.
The intensity is different across the. Sorry, the intensity is the same across the shroud, but that seems obviously wrong because there's a gradation of intensity based on which is what gives rise to the three-dimensionality. So I'm not actually sure what you're talking about.
No, so that's not true. So there is lights and dark.
Are you talking about the pigmentation versus the penetration of the fibers or something? I'm not really sure.
No, so
if there's something you could share, that might clarify.
Well, do you have Luigi Garlascelli's paper itself? There should be like a micro photograph of it's colored blue.
But yeah, like you know when you were saying when you were showing that graph, for example, right?
Yeah.
So you definitely are saying there's different amounts of radiation exposure, which accounts for the dating being different. And then you're also saying what wait, hang on. Yeah, so is that part true?
Sorry, there's different amounts of radiation.
Different. Yeah, you're saying that on the shroud, different parts of it are exposed to different amounts of radiation, right?
Right. So it's a bit complicated. The shroud image.
But just is that true? Just to make sure that claim is true in your view.
It is, but there's because the way it is, it's proton particles, but they have a positive charge, I think. So it's what actually colors the images is not like protons crashing.
Well, let's see if that's relevant in a sec. But I just want to establish, like, make sure. So that is true that they are exposed to different amounts of radiation, right?
Yeah,
and then
numbers of protons. Yeah.
And then you're also saying it's true that the image is produced by the radiation, right? So there's a causal story about the interaction of the radiation with the shroud that produces the image.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
But then you're also saying that the image is uniform throughout. So now what needs to be true for the image to be uniform throughout and caused by the radiation and for there to be different levels of radiation is that maybe there's some kind of process where the pigmentation that the radiation produces diminishes. You're sharing your email, by the way, James. I don't know if you want to share your email.
Sorry.
You know, where the pigmentation where it diminishes, where the pigmentation diminishes above a certain amount, so it's all just hit that maximum limit. Is that true?
Okay, so yeah, I was just trying.
I've got the Garlascelli here. Which is there a diagram here that was relevant?
Here it is. Yeah, so if you're doing Garlascelli, I was trying to find the causal process of Bob Rucker, but so there should be scroll up. It's a photo micrograph of
this one.
I think it's colored. Okay, so yeah, that's the one. You can see those little white things, little spots and strips. That's snow fencing, so it's not uniformly colored.
The white strip, you've lost me. So we see the fibers and the discoloration of the fibers.
You don't believe it's uniformly colored on the shroud, though, right?
Yeah, it is uniform on the shroud.
But we showed this. This looks very similar to the shroud. I can bring that up. I'm completely lost, to be honest, as to what you're talking about.
I don't really understand what this claim is about the uniformity, because there are bits of different, like that's how there is an image, right? It appears different.
That's what I was saying.
Well, so the darkness and the lightness on a macroscopic level that translates to the 3D info is based.
Oh, God's intervened.
Fibrils.
Oh, there we go.
So it's not like one fiber is colored more darkly than another fiber.
Well, they sort of are, right? Because there's a different color that we see. So it
not plus or minus 2% is the quantified number that Stirp team got.
Oh, right. So yeah, so it's a different degree, but I mean, why is that there is a difference?
The amount of difference is different. Yeah. But one is hundreds of years old and the other's not. Yeah, if that's what you mean.
Yeah, but that doesn't matter. Like, we would still have evidence of snow fencing, right? If it was
hang on, before what snow fencing is.
Yeah. If it was powdered, so if there was pigment here in these areas concentrated in certain spots more than others, then we would have darker spots in the middle of one thread, like corresponding.
There's not currently pigment on the shroud, or at least maybe there's a few residues here and there, but that's not currently what gives rise to the image.
Yeah,
No
it's
one's
the
saying
oxidation from when
it's
it was
discoloration of the fibers
Right,
themselves.
but
There's not pigment that's on the shroud.
Right, but
What currently? I think there was pigment, but not anymore, or at least maybe there's a few traces left. But
which
not-
led to chemical aging of the.
But
bits
that was what I
wasn't
said. I said that the hypothesis is not that. But that's what Gallishelli did. Like he applied pigment and then washed it off.
and it
But
was
that's the whole
still there.
point of his
It was
process.
still there afterwards. Like
What do you
in
mean it was
certain
still there?
spots,
Well, yeah, but
the crevices and that.
well,
Oh,
it's,
yeah, well,
it's
there
still
probably
there
was,
on the
right?
shroud as well. That's the
Yeah.
same on the shroud.
There's not.
So
I know there
they
is.
studied it, and there isn't. There
So
isn't
Dale,
the
your
pigment.
argument is that there's still traces of pigment on the Gallishelli, but not on the shroud. Is that the difference? Because Gallishelli washed off the pigment, but
that
there's still some
accounts
bits
for
left.
But that Walter Macron guy you just appealed to, he said that there was, right? So when Walter Macron agrees with you, it's all good. But when he says something that disagrees, he's not good anymore.
I'm just trying to understand what the claim
Correct,
is, because I still don't
so
understand.
we named dozens of spectral instruments. So if there was paint or residue pigments in the concentration using Gallishelli's method, we would still be able to detect that specifically in the image areas and crevices of the threads.
Okay, so the claim is that there's less residual pigment on the shroud than the Gallishelli.
No,
Is
he's
that the
saying
claim?
there's none. He's saying there's no residual.
Well, that's
pigment.
consistent with less. None is less. Is that the claim, Dale?
So yes, that correspond to images and this image forming mechanism. Now,
Well,
there
how
is
much-
contamination. So I want to be clear. There are paint particles that have been discovered on the shroud, but those
Yes.
are all over the shroud. It's not just
Right.
in image
Well,
areas or the
yes,
day.
that's the big thing. Yes, we agree with that. But
We
so-
agree. Okay.
But how do you
Well,
know
yeah,
how
that's
much
what I was
pigment? So there's a quantitative difference in the amount of residual pigment on Gallishelli versus Shroud. How do you know how much residual pigment is on Gallishelli? Because I don't see that in the paper, the Gallishelli paper, like the same
It's-
quantification.
Well, you can just, even by looking at this, you can see there's residue amounts that change the intensity of the color beyond just a 2%
Oops.
variation. It's evident even for me.
You're
as
saying
not-
that's pigment?
Yeah, but that's like getting
That's
two
not,
pictures of a.
is my
That's like
understanding.
it's like getting two pictures of toast, right? And saying one of them's more burnt than the other, so they couldn't have been produced by the same causal process because they like it's not. It's a really that the causal process has a disanalogy, which is 1,000 years of weathering, right, and being handled. And
Yeah, well,
exposed to
that's obviously
elements
where the. So I was trying to understand what the claim was. The claim seems to be something about the difference in the amount of pigment, but there's an obvious explanation for that. So I don't understand why that's considered to be a strong argument for anything.
Well, because he watched it. He simulated the aging.
simulated. Yeah, it's not.
Yes.
It's
There's your
massively
explanation.
different.
But that, no, but I mean, it was thoroughly
Yes.
washed. It was thoroughly.
It doesn't
washed.
matter. It doesn't matter.
So Dale, what I'm trying to understand what your claim is, because so you're saying that Gallishelli washed the shroud. Yes, we know that,
Mhm.
and therefore there shouldn't be pigment on it.
Right. It should be like the Shroud of Turin. It should be totally gone, even in the crevices of these
Why?
threads, because
I don't understand why.
the pigment particles will get caught up in these areas. They can't be washed out, and that's what even
Okay,
Walter
so that's
Macron
why
was-
we would.
even what Walter Macron was saying would inevitably happen with this snow fencing thing. That's what snow fencing.
Oh, so you're saying that so you're saying that if the shroud had pigments applied like the Gallishelli, we should see more pigment on it than we actually do.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
I
But
wish
how
I
do you
could-
know how much pigment you'd expect to see after 700 years of handling? Because Gallishelli washed it and handled it a little bit for, I don't know, weeks maybe. The shroud has been, well, actually, I don't even know, has it been washed? Does anyone know that? But even
Some
aside from that, it's been
skeptics
handled for hundreds of
say so.
years and went through fires. So how do you know how much pigment you'd expect to see?
Exactly. From just normal wear and tear, we can see what powdered pigments. I don't know. I'm just saying that
You seem to be just
experts
making
who
it up
study-
that there's less than you
that
would
was
expect.
brilliant.
This comes
Dale,
from
that was
Walter-
an amazing answer you just gave when you said, "I don't know." I love
I
that.
don't. The answer
was
is
great.
I don't know, but
Yeah, that's great.
I'm saying that I'm
That's
quoting
fine.
the
That's
experts,
honestly
Walter,
fine.
Walter McCrone, who's an atheist and a skeptic, and he says this would be a problem. So, and he has studied tons of documents. He invented the field. He's one of the founders of the field. So I
Okay,
trust
well,
him on. Like,
I don't.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Here's
Assuming
another
that he's saying what you were saying he's saying, which I'm not sure that you are because you don't seem to understand the claim very well, to be honest.
Right. Okay. So here's the next one then, right? So here's something that Garla Shelley himself, the guy who did the experiment, said he utterly failed, and it's superficiality. So that in his I understand in his paper he says I achieve superficiality. That's a lie, right? What he
Could
means.
you explain to everyone what you mean by that?
Yeah. So there are 3 levels of superficiality. So the color itself is only on the top superficial layers of the shroud. So the first is the macroscopic level, the fabric level. And that just means, look, the color's on the one side of the shroud. It doesn't penetrate to the back. And that's true. Garla Shelley achieved that result. So congratulations. That's easy. Literally every artistic mechanism achieves that. But then
Don't downplay what he did. He did a good job.
Well, hang on. Except
Well
for
done,
the neutron hypothesis, right? Because that wouldn't account for that because neutrons would travel through the cloth.
But protons wouldn't. So there you go.
Well, maybe we need to talk about protons because I'm not quite sure where protons came from. Because we've been talking about neutrons, but now there's protons as well.
Right. So protons are responsible.
So protons were also emitted at the same time.
Yeah. Here, let me share.
Wait, why were neutrons emitted too then?
So let me share.
Well, I
my
guess
screen.
one of them
Here's
was
Bob's.
the neutrons were emitted to confound the carbon dating method, and then the protons were emitted to actually form the image.
Yeah.
As I
All right,
understand
so
it.
you're kind of So the protons. So here's Bob Rucker's.
Two.
So this is his hypothesis.
On this. The best explanation.
Sorry, I won't play it. I'll just show you.
Yeah.
So
Oh, it's
this is
SJ.
step 1. 0.00. Sorry, SJ.
It's
Yeah,
SJ.
yeah. I was on her channel. It is SJ. Yeah. So yep. So here are the steps, right? I'm not a scientist. I can't explain, but this is according to him. The laws of physics fully explain this, and no skeptical physicists have challenged this. They've affirmed that.
Well, presumably, though, not many skeptical physicists are engaging with this as well. Presumably,
That's true. I can only think of a couple that interacted with this, but yeah, they say this would occur cause and effect order, right? So first, this is the rapid vertical oscillation of the nuclei in the body. This is the supernatural miracle. This is God did it part.
Yeah, but why did God oscillate nuclei rather than just
Well,
making
we already
neutron
talked about that,
protein?
Nathan. I feel like that's
Yes,
being
okay,
a
sorry.
at that point.
Yeah,
Save
sorry.
the threefold.
No, ignore. Yeah, sorry.
But then, so he says, okay, then this happened. 0.004% of the deuterium nuclei split. That in turn led to protons and neutrons being emitted vertically. That in turn caused the vertically collimated protons to exit the body, obviously. The protons deposit their positive charge on cloth. So it's not radiation damage, that they're not hitting the cloth. And this caused the corona discharge between the body and the cloth. That led to an alternating electric current in the top fibers. There's superficiality, causing an oscillating electrical and magnetic fields.
What?
It's very detailed, right? Like I can't explain how this works.
Well, it gets each of these steps. I'm finding increasingly.
Yeah, this could be
less
modeled
probable.
though. These processes could be modeled. I'd be interested to see that the paper.
Yeah, well, me too. But
published
I guess what I'm saying about each of these steps is that, like each of them seems to reduce the probability further. Like, let's say we're in the space where it's given that step happened. Like, then what's the probability that this is the causal outcome, right? And I think that there's a lot of stochastic type causation in each of these, at least from maybe I'm wrong about that, but it needs to be detailed.
I think you're wrong. Like this is the laws of, from this step onwards, it's just the laws of physics. This is what will happen. And proven.
The laws of physics are stochastic. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Where did we get the image formation? Is that from the heat's deposited? What generates the actual image though?
Well, that's the heat deposited on the 0.2. That's that's oxidizing the cellulose, right? That's what's causing the cellulose.
Well, you need to have an oxidative agent. Maybe, I don't know.
So this has been experimentally proven. They've done actual experiments with ultraviolet radiation as well as this is
this is proton and neutron radiation, not ultraviolet radiation.
Right, but this is known to happen. Like, this isn't controversial in science.
Well, with ultraviolet, though, that is a really relevant distinction, right? Because
yes,
because it's just a different. Maybe it was ultraviolet that God used, right? But the point is that that's a different theory, and we don't need protons.
Here's the thing with ultraviolet. Why do I reject that? So Paulo de Lazzaro is a scientist. Again, he's published in peer-reviewed papers doing experiments.
Sorry. It's not that you might have independent reasons to reject it. Obviously you do. The problem is that appealing to people showing that they can produce an image with ultraviolet radiation doesn't establish that you can produce this image with proton radiation, because they're different things.
Yeah, but there have been experiments with proton radiation as well.
Oh, really?
There are experiments doing with various forms of radiation. There's another guy, I forget his name.
Well, various forms of radiation. I only really care about.
I have a high-level question about this. You say
that
you say that these things have been shown in various papers, and people have experimentally verified this and that. Right. Why don't you show us those papers instead of a slide from a slideshow presentation on a YouTube video? I can't assess this; it's too vague, and I don't have any way to verify what's being said here. If you actually shared the papers, then I could. I mean, obviously, I know we're nearing the end of the stream now, but this is one of the things that has been a constant issue, that you share slides from YouTube presentations or, a HTML that we looked at, and you don't actually share the papers. It makes it very hard for me to assess the evidence being given, because I just have your word for it that this has been verified and properly documented and that the research was carried out well. Whereas in Nathan and my YouTube video, we showed a lot of the papers that we were talking about and actually went through them. I know we didn't do a perfect job, but that just makes it really hard for me to assess this, because a lot of it just comes down to do I trust what you're saying about what this guy is saying? When I know that this guy has devoted a lot of his time to demonstrating the Shroud to be authentic, so I don't fully trust what he says. I want to see that it's independently been validated, and I can't tell that from any of this.
Yeah, I think that's a fair criticism. Again, obviously, for the sake of an entertaining show, I didn't prepare anything. I wasn't anticipating reading through a peer review paper or even showing YouTube videos and stuff like that.
Well, that's sort of all right, but on the other hand, you are saying that you are at that point where you understand and have those reasons. So even if you couldn't produce them in a polished way, you should if you are justified rationally on the basis of these reasons, you should know what they are, right?
Yeah. So what I was going to say is, if we do a round 3 with Otangelo, I think Nathan said he might be up for that. Okay, then when we do that, I will come with those papers and show those papers directly.
Well, ideally, the best way to do that is to share them in advance, right? And then so we can read the same papers. We'll each share 5 papers we think are most important or whatever. Have a read of them beforehand, and then we're ready to discuss the details.
I think that's a great idea. Yeah, I will be up for that. So. Okay, the last thing I want to say, though, about Garlashelli is on that superficiality. I'll just end with this, right? So, again, I'm appealing to Garlashelli himself, who admits that on the thread level and the fiber levels, so only the top 2 to 3 fibers are colored in a thread, right? And on the fiber level, it's only that primary cell wall. 0.2 nanometers. I think you guys even affirmed that much.
But however, I will say I'm not very confident in how uniform that is. I genuinely just don't know. But I agree that that's parts of it.
And because we're in for truth, I will argue against it. So admittedly, I studied the peer-reviewed papers because Hugh Ferry denies the thread level superficiality. And in one paper by Pellicore and Evans, I think it is, they say that it's 3 to 4 fibers out of the 200 in a thread. So there is one paper that contradicts just the 2 to 3. So yeah, but the point is Garlashelli's results don't get that, and even Garlashelli himself admits that he doesn't get these results on a microscopic level, and his answer was so what? Again, I have nothing to show you to prove whether I'm lying or not, but if that's true, let's pretend.
Well, you also might not be lying, but it's possible that you're like mishandling the data, or not, like that you don't have the tools to assess what's being said, or, like assess whether it's coming from a credible source. Like there's all sorts of, like, it's possible, like my belief, just to be completely transparent, is more in line with that you're not lying, but have developed false beliefs because of a reason, because of a lot of those sorts of effects, rather than it being like that you're a liar or something, or dishonest with, I don't.
Fair enough.
Like, I think you seem very honest from what I like, and again, obviously, given our disagreement, I think honest, but like mistaken.
Fair enough. Yeah, I'll take it, because I always try to it's about finding truth. So I think that it is possible. I find it unlikely. I mean, like, given the testimony I've heard from certain panel review shows and stuff like that as well, where he is full on admitted that he doesn't get 3-dimensional results, or there are VP8 images from what I remember of his method where it's not comparable to the Shroud at all. The hairline is off, the cheeks are like sunken in and stuff like that. So
yeah, I agree there are differences. I guess the question that I'd want to see answered is, if you take how much of the variation in the images is just accounted for by like different bas reliefs versus the actual process of image production, right? That's the thing I kind of care about.
Yes, and that's what I understand Gala Shelley to be saying when because I'm not sure about the exact details of the microscopic superficiality, because I don't think he talks about that in the paper to that detail. But he does say in the paper that his reproduction doesn't exactly match the Shroud in various details. And his argument, which I find convincing, is that no reproduction can ever precisely match any historical artifact, because you don't know the precise details of how it was produced, and there's so many variables that could be changed into like the exact consistency of whatever pigment and the base that it was used and how it was applied in the bas relief and how it was aged, and all of these things will result in differences, which could be macroscopic, could be microscopic. What I find convincing about that is a demonstration of the general process of using a bas relief and a real body combination and applying a pigment, washing it off, aging it in the oven, produces a discoloration in generally a discoloration of the fibers in a general pattern that matches the Shroud. I find that convincing enough that a medieval artist could have produced a similar effect. Obviously not exactly the same, using somewhat different processes. Obviously you're going to disagree with that. There's always some extrapolation beyond the evidence there. But by contrast, I find that the hypothesis about neutrons and protons to be very implausible and ad hoc. And also, I don't know enough about the details because I've not been able to find any details about it. But that maybe we can talk more about that at a future date. So that's how I assess the two hypotheses. One seems very underspecified and ad hoc, designed specifically to generate the data like that we see, including the carbon dating. The other seems to be someone who's actually made a reproduction using plausible methods that seems to be with some extrapolations to account for how the Shroud could have been produced. So that's where I'm at. So what someone asked, by the way, what could change my mind? And I would say that one of the things would be more information about the neutron hypothesis to convince me that it's actually like plausible and makes sense, and that it's not just sort of gerrymandered. So that's one thing.
In my defense, I tried to invite Bob to come on the show so that we could.
That's fine. We can talk more about it another time. I don't want to hold you like to something like that, but we can.
Yeah, it's not your fault. But I would also say that when people who claim to be in like a position of authority do pass up on opportunities to talk to people who are interested in the things that they're interested in, that is sometimes a bit of a red flag for me about like their motivations. And like I get it, like there could be pure motivations there as well, but it's also something that people who are kind of like crackpots do to isolate themselves from criticism, as well as something that people who are very busy do who do. So
okay, well, just to defend Bob, because I do know, so he's not one of the crackpots. I will give him credit because he does come on and debate the experts and stuff. He had a reason why he couldn't show up to this thing or whatever, but like he actually debates experts like Hugh Ferry, who in depth and I think he's even debated Jordan, the nuclear engineer.
I mean, the thing is, like kind of, yeah, it depends. I just think, what James and I take it that we're fairly civil. We have interested points, and we want to talk about this stuff. And it just seems odd to me that someone would want to pass up on that.
Yeah, well, I said, I like you guys, how you handled it and stuff. That's why I wanted to bring you on and stuff like that. So sometimes people are sensitive when you're like, when you were going after Giulio Fonte, they didn't like that, or calling Gary Habermas a grandpa and stuff. But I understand how it is. I'm not perfect on my own podcast. I think we have to go with the flow and get together. We've had a great conversation, a civil conversation. Yeah, the last thing I'll say for tonight, I think on the image formation, we've come to a great point where we have to, are these features that I'm talking about, where Garlashelli fails on, are they essential? It's not just a side product, like, oh, I duplicated a face, but it doesn't have a beard. Aha, you haven't replicated the shroud. No, that these features and properties are essential. If you don't duplicate these, you haven't replicated the shroud. And one case in point for you, Nathan, to end on, that is inherent to the process, you asked for that, is the vertical mapping of the shroud images. So you guys agreed it's vertically mapped. That's why radiation guys have to posit this vertically.
Well, I guess what I'm saying when I say that, just to be really clear about what I'm saying, is that there is an inference that you can make about the density of the image at different points, where you can translate that into a vertical dimension and produce a type of image on the basis of that. That's the claim that I'm making.
Okay. So here's what I wanted to say about Garlashelli. So again, no Pro-Shroud guys. I'm quoting a Shroud skeptic who just published recently. He's a forensic computer analyst. His name's Cicero Moraes, right? And Pro-Shroud guys don't like him, but he did a test with an actual shallow bas relief like Garlashelli used, and he proved in his paper that any bas relief, shallow or deep, will always create some lateral distortions, which make it inconsistent with the shroud. You can't get the strictly vertically, the path P, as John Jackson would call it, the projection path. It inherently will never give you those results. I'm not really again, the claim that you're making here, is kind of like, it's too vague for me to assess why I should think that's true, because at least as far as I can see currently, the only thing that has to be true to produce this sort of 3D mapping effect is that you have some coloration being produced on the surface somehow, and that varies in pigmentation. As long as those two criteria are met, it's possible to produce an image with this 3D information in the right sort of way. You just have to vary how the causal process worked in that case to produce the right density to get you that specific type of stretch in that direction. So it's not really, I've not understood from what you've said why it's not possible for a bas relief to produce the type of image density that we see. Even the sentence that you said about the vertical stretch, I don't know why that's the case. I don't understand why I should think that that's true, or why a combination of aging process and oxidative damage from the deposition couldn't explain a difference in image from the image produced, from the image produced by the pigment. So it's not established from my point of view. And just to clarify, it's not about the density. That's the three-dimensionality aspect. It's more about, if you wrapped a face, your face in the shroud, a circular object, and had something on your face, then you flatten the cloth, you're going to get a mask of Agamemnon effect. That it's a wraparound distortion effect. And what Cicero is saying here is that even with shallow bas reliefs, it's much less pronounced than a full statue or a 3D head. But there are always these lateral distortions that aren't on the shroud.
Well, I guess one thing someone could do if they were sufficiently motivated would be to kind of retrodict what a bas relief would be like for the shroud image or something like that, and use a CAD/CAM machine to produce that. And I can't see anything I understand theoretically that would prevent someone from doing that. But
well, the paper shows that it's theoretically impossible, but there's nothing I can say about that. But one thing I'm interested in about the hypothesis that the shroud was produced by UV radiation. Is that what Rucker thinks? Is that part of his hypothesis? I wasn't quite sure.
That's so John Jackson and a guy named Paulo de Lazaro. He's the one doing the actual experiments recently. Now, Bob Rucker says that's a good secondary hypothesis, but there's one major problem with it. Same as we were just talking about with Garland Shelley, superficiality. He's been having problems in his experiments replicating the same superficiality we see on the Shroud, and it's a matter of what fraction of a second. Yeah. So that's why I prefer particle radiation over electromagnetic forms, because there's always.
But why not like an unknown method of painting?
Well, I guess because there is no paint composing the Shroud images. So yeah, that would have to be there on a chemical level. Also, painting.
Sorry. I mean depositing pigment. But the point is some kind of deposition of a substance that would lead to oxidative damage on the fibers. Is what I'm saying? Like why not some unknown technique for applying it?
So an unknown technique. So I think.
But it's still going to be a painting technique, just one you don't know about. Like, for example, I don't think that you have like a background in fine art history or something. So if we went to like some art gallery, you probably wouldn't be able to tell me what technique some painter used to draw some picture or something like that, right? Why not assume it's like that?
So I think that the argument that would come more from history, and it's just historically implausible. So, if you're trying to say, oh well, we had this secret
more or less plausible than neutron radiation in history. How many times in history do we come across artistic techniques we don't know about versus neutron radiation?
Not a lot at all. Actually, I think we know.
But as compared to neutron radiation bursts.
Well, we've never come. It's obviously a unique event, so yeah, we've never come across a neutron radiation event like that. But I mean, I don't think in terms of those frequentist terms for the prior probability, but
in Bayesian terms,
it could be an unknown, or it could pigment, or it could not be. So 50-50, right?
Okay. Well, we have evidence that says it's less than 50%, right? So someone like a non-religious agnostic, Dr. Thomas de Westlow, he is a medieval art historian, a world's expert. He's pro-Shroud. He was convinced to be pro-Shroud. He doesn't believe in God, doesn't believe in Christianity or anything like this.
Yeah, well, Dr. James Fodor disagrees with you.
Dr.
What does it mean for him to be? What does it mean for someone to be pro-Shroud but not a Christian? So he believes that it was a miracle produced by.
No.
So what does that mean exactly?
So he believes that the Shroud covered the historical Jesus, and the images were created through some natural process. He doesn't know what it is, but he doesn't believe in the miracle stuff. He doesn't believe Jesus was God or rose from the dead.
Really weird thing.
That is a very strange hypothesis, because if you think it was produced by an unknown natural hypothesis, you could just say that it was produced by anyone lying under the Shroud. I don't understand how you would know that it's Jesus specifically. But what does he think?
I guess these are the sorts of points, though, that I was trying to make to Dale earlier as well, about establishing the miracle, right? Like, why not that before the...
Yeah, sure. Let's go with that.
So do you mean like establishing it's Jesus in particular, you're saying? Or
well, both Jesus in particular, and that it's caused by God rather than an unknown natural process.
Okay.
And
so let me answer this. Okay, so in terms of it being
a demon could do it, right? Like a demon could want to produce a false sign to...
Oh, you're giving me three things now to... Okay, so I'm going to forget these in order. But okay, so in terms of it being Jesus, I think the best argument is clearly from the context. Look, even you Shroud skeptics see that it's obviously Jesus. You think it's artwork meant to portray Jesus up.
But the reason that I think that is because of the religious context of medieval Europe that I think the Shroud originated in. If I was like in a vacuum, if I was in 200 BC and you showed me, in ancient Greece and you showed me that Shroud, I wouldn't think it was Jesus. Or if I was born in Indonesia in 400 and you showed me the Shroud.
But Nathan, that's irrelevant. Like, whoever produced the Shroud, like, I don't understand.
Oh no, you cut out. Your internet cut out, James.
Okay, so I would use forensic pathologist Bob Rucker's argument. This is the one I think works, that clearly this thing depicts Jesus as explained in the Gospels, right? The crown of thorns, the chest wound, scourge wounds all over the body,
Yeah, but
And
every
picture
explanation of the
historically.
origin of the shroud has it
Sorry.
so that it is or intends to be a depiction of Jesus. That doesn't distinguish between the hypotheses.
Well, I haven't finished. You guys I never get to finish my sentence.
Yeah, Nathan interrupted with something that was irrelevant. That's why I was trying to get beyond that.
Okay. So there are these contextual wounds and stuff like that. There's also the context of presuming I've done my work with the science and proving that there are images that go beyond the laws of nature or something like that, or that are
Wait, what?
miraculous in nature.
I don't know what that would mean.
But you don't think that.
I do
You think that it was a
images
natural
are miraculous.
process. Just that with the
Oh,
radiation
comes to
triggered by God.
electrons.
But you mean there'd be
Okay.
no way to trigger the radiation naturally? Is that what you mean? Like the protons and neutrons in a culminated way?
No, okay. So I believe in miracle, in that it's a miraculous thing. I don't think the natural form works.
Oh yeah,
But
we know that,
Thomas de
yeah.
Weselo, he would be the natural. So he would say, look, who else in history do we know? The only person, these are unique wounds that were not dished out together to anyone else known to history. So the most reasonable explanation, Bob Buckland argues, is, yeah, this is Jesus. This is
But
best
the alternative explanation would be it's someone trying to look like Jesus.
Well, I don't.
Well,
Or
and we
even
have
that it's
lots of
just
evidence that
a-
people do that a lot. Like they
Or
try
a
to
random
replicate.
Roman torture victim, right? I mean, I don't think that
So
the
if you-
wounds
No, I don't think
are
that works,
historical,
Nathan, because it's
it-
got all of the signs taken from the Gospels. I don't know why you keep bringing up this point. This seems to
So
be
if you-
obviously wrong to me.
It depends what date you give
From the
me, right?
Gospels.
So
Oh, you could've-
if you're giving me a first century, even a Roman date, there's limits on that. I find it highly implausible that Romans would appease someone and crucify them to make them look like Jesus.
Oh no, not to, they wouldn't be doing it to make them look like Jesus. It would just be that these are the sorts of things that they do to torture and crucify people. Like there's a lot of apocalyptic prophets in that context,
and they don't do. Name one apocalyptic prophet with a crown of thorns and a chest wound.
Well, I don't know exactly, right? Because it's not something I've looked into a lot. But if I just said like Honey the circle drawer, I don't think you would know that that's wrong either. Because like, if I just said like Bob, right, or something like.
I think that we have to engage in abductive reasoning, and there's only one person known in history who went through that sequence of events. So I think the best explanation of the data is to go, yeah, that's probably Jesus.
I genuinely don't know that that's true. Like the more I've looked into apocalyptic prophets, the more common Jesus's sort of like narrative is in terms of them doing a bunch of stuff that the Romans didn't like and then ending up getting crucified. Like, I mean, the Romans came in and destroyed the temple a little bit later. They really commonly do. James, you might want to turn off your camera or something, by the way, just because your internet's really bad.
Yeah, but again, the uniqueness is about the wounds, not just. Of course, there are other Messiah claimants and stuff, and there are similarities and disanalogies to Jesus.
But there's nothing that unique about the wounds. I mean, if you're right that the wounds are produced by a Roman flagellum, which I think is historically wrong, as we went into a lot of detail about, right?
I agree with your assessment fully on the flagellum. Well, no, sorry, not fully. So I think it's consistent, could be consistent with the first century Roman scourge weapon, but we have no proof as to what they were. So we can't say either way. Like,
yeah, and it's better explained by the hypothesis that it's the product of the medieval imagination, given the way that they thought about the scourging event in reflections from their theology on the Passion, right?
I disagree with that part. That's the only part I disagree with. But
well, that definitely is true from the depictions in the art that we can see that predate the Shroud, right?
I don't think so. I think you're reading into those.
I showed that, like, I showed flagellum with point endings. I mean, the paper talked about it extensively, the provenance of those sorts of things.
Yeah, there have been counter paper. You're talking about Andrea Nicolotti, right? And there have been counters to that. I didn't read.
But what's the content though of the counters? Because if maybe there are counters, but until we actually know what those are, you have to deal with the fact that the content shows that it's wrong and more consistent with medieval, like, you know, consistent with the medieval imagery.
Okay, yeah, I'll send you those papers. This isn't a question that interested me, so I didn't read into that because I'm like, there's no disproof or proof. I just don't use this argument. So, okay, so that's my argument as to how I would establish Jesus. If that doesn't convince you, fair enough. What was the second question about miracles that you asked me again? There's three things you asked me, and I lost track of the second one.
Yeah, I can't particularly remember either. But I tell you what, I got a super chat really early on. And I'm gonna have to go like about now, to be honest. So maybe, I think James has dropped out because of his internet. But maybe you could answer this Skeptics and Scoundrels super chat from earlier, and then we'll probably wrap things up. So, considering we can reframe any evidence to confirm a claim, does Dale have any clear falsification criteria for the Shroud he could share? So, like, what could you find out that would make you not believe in the legitimacy of the Shroud?
Sure. Okay, so here's a great question. Thank you, Skeptics and Scoundrels. Yeah, no, I don't know if that's off Skeptics and Seekers, my old podcast, or not, but okay, so here's one thing that wouldn't work. So all of this stuff about the history, which we spent most of the night on, believe it or not, I'm unique and weird in the Pro-Shroud world in that I don't give a rat's patoot about it. Let's pretend the Shroud's medieval. I don't care. I still think the science proves this thing's a miraculous image. So God could have done a medieval miracle to authenticate Christianity. And that would entail why, anything you want to say, why he has anatomical inaccuracies, which he doesn't, but let's say he does, or he depicts a medieval depiction of a scourge wound or a medieval thing. Well, that God had to do it that way so the medieval people would accept this and preserve it to the modern day where we could get the STURP team in there to do the scientific evidence. So the history of the Shroud, I argue, is totally irrelevant. So that's not a falsification. What would falsify it for me is based on the scientific evidence. So case in point, if you provide an ordinary natural or ordinary artistic mechanism, which provably fulfills what I call the minimal relevant features, and I've got a list of about 13 to 14 of them, and they explain all of these features, then I will agree with you that that would be a falsification of an argument for a miracle. No, we provably have.
What are like the main features of that? Just you don't have to go through them all, but like just to give people an idea, I guess.
So the main one, obviously, it's people say it's a photo negative. Technically, you might say it's a semi-negative or a full-on photo negative. We don't know. There's the three-dimensionality. There's the body image uniformity, which comes in two aspects. So we were talking about the intensity of color. There's also the maximum density of colors, how dark they are from the front, and the dorsal side images, they're uniform on both. And you can picture certain mechanisms just due to the effects of gravity, that wouldn't be the case, because the backside would be pressed in and darker.
It depends on the production, right? Like if it doesn't matter. Yeah, sorry, you go ahead.
No worries. Then there's the vertically mapped wrapping distortions. I personally think that's the most important feature that no image forming mechanism comes close to reproducing. Then there's the three levels of superficiality. Then I have what's called anatomical accuracies. So just like there are counter features with anatomical inaccuracies that need to be addressed, there are certain accuracies that we can detect swelling or in the body or rigor mortis. My friend Teddy Pappas just published in a peer-reviewed medical journal today. And I think I actually have that. Oh, no, I don't. I thought I had that up. But I'll link to it in my blog. You guys go and check it out, about how we can prove this body was in rigor mortis after having gone through a cardiovascular spasm or something like that. I'm not a medical expert. She does the arguments. So that's another feature. Also, there's the chemical features: no paint, no powdered pigments, no stains or dyes or anything like that. There's no silver, which is important for some theories, and no biochemicals, right? So there isn't sufficient signs of decomposition liquids on the Shroud. And then there are this last category of properties about the blood stains themselves. Blood stains, for example, there's no body images underneath the blood stains, which suggests, it's not ironclad proof, but highly suggests the blood stains were put on the Shroud first, then whatever caused the body images did its thing. That's inconsistent with most artistic mechanisms. The bloodstains are in pristine position. How they would flow and congeal, this is Dr. Gilbert Lavoie's quote, on human skin, kind of thing. And they're very medically accurate, and they're not smudged. There's no alteration or thermal damage or any sort of degradation of those bloodstains in a way that you would expect with certain mechanisms, right? Where there would be smearing or some evidence of alteration of the bloodstains at the very least. So I think just offhand, those are the main ones. Also, the images don't fluoresce, which prove. So I think you guys were laughing at Giulio Fonte. The skeptics were saying, well, why are you assuming 200 degrees Celsius? Well, it's because ultraviolet fluorescence studies prove that the shroud images and the shroud itself, except for the burn holes, they don't fluoresce red. They were not privy to temperatures in excess of 200 degrees Celsius, which is categorized as a hot scorch. So that's empirical data. We know that the shroud, in the majority, was not subject to those temperatures for however that was the case. Is that good enough? That's what I remember of it.
Wait, so what are the things that would show you were wrong? Sorry.
That I was wrong? Yeah.
Yeah. What would you have to find out? Just like a short.
Come up with a falsification. Come up with a method that actually duplicates the shroud MRS. And I'll give you an example that I thought worked. This is back in 2017, and why I didn't believe in the shroud at that time. I still continue my research.
Do you think do you remember, I don't know if you saw the clip where Matt Fradd thought that a picture of the bas-relief image production was an image of the shroud until the guy who was on his podcast said that it wasn't? Like, do you think that that's good enough for him? Like, is that sufficient for being thinking that the image is close? No.
So Gary Habermas says I disagree with him. I think if you want the best artistic mechanism, it's actually a scorch by Dr. Colin Berry. He has a toastograph hypothesis. That's the artistic mechanism I think is way better than Garlashelli's. But yeah, all the Pine Creek Doug, I remember he tried to play the same trick on me, but I didn't fall for it. I recognized Garlashelli's work once he brought it up on the screen and I could see it properly.
Skeptics and Scoundrels has rephrased their question.
Okay.
They said, can you fill in the blank? If I found out, I would stop believing.
In the shreds. Okay, well, let me give you, this actually is a real world example of me in 2017. I found out that there's a mechanism, it's an ordinary natural one called the electric charge separation mechanism. By a couple
But is there like a simple way you could put this in the set? Like, what would you find out, without sort of maybe talking about a lot of these details and things?
I found a non-miraculous image forming mechanism, whatever it is, that explains all of the MRFs, all of those essential properties of the images, of the body and bloodstain images. Right there, it's falsified. How can you argue it's a miracle when we have proof? No, a natural explanation can account for the data.
The problem is, I think that's not really, that's just a repackaging of what it would mean to disagree and have an explanation. Like, it's not something that you would find out. That's what you're saying is like, if I thought it was best explained by something that wasn't my hypothesis, then I would think it was best explained by something that wasn't my hypothesis. I think what the questioner wants is like, if they retested a patch, if I found out that a patch from the center dated within the range of the previous carbon dating, I would stop believing, or something like that, right?
Okay, well, if that was the case, I would stop believing the shroud covered the historical Jesus. But like I said, the dating is irrelevant for me. I'm open to a medieval miracle. I really don't care when that thing dates from. Ultimately, in terms of the miraculous evidence. So by stop believing, if you just mean stop believing it covered Jesus, yeah. If we carbon date any other area of that shroud and we don't get something that corresponds to Bob's MCMP calculations, that would falsify the neutron hypothesis. And I think I would go with a natural explanation, like the one that Brian Walsh suggests, and that you guys go for.
Right.
Can you hear me, Nathan? I can't tell how my audio is coming through.
You are coming in now. I think you were chopping up a little bit before, though, and I think that's...
I can't figure out what the problem is. I can't find any issue on mine. But anyway, Dale, this is a little interesting from you to say. So your claim is that it seems to me that you're saying that if the Shroud carbon dated to the 1st century, you would not believe that it covered Jesus. That would be disconfirming evidence for you.
You mean, so in 1988, instead of getting medieval...
No, I imagine there was a new carbon dating, and it resolved the issues of the first one, and it did 3 different parts of the cloth, and they all came back to the 1st century. Hypothetically. That would be disconfirming evidence for you.
So that would be... No, like that would be disconfirming evidence of Bob's neutron absorption hypothesis.
Right. But you would still believe that it was... Okay, so that wouldn't... I thought that you'd said that if the neutron hypothesis was disconfirmed, then you would prefer a natural hypothesis. But now it seems like you're saying that's not the case.
So like if the neutron absorption hypothesis were to be falsified, I mean, I could play the game you guys are with your unknown natural thing, and I could say, well, unknown supernatural thing explains the carbon dating. But I don't know if I would do that in reality. I would probably just lean towards the natural.
Also, don't think you'd ever do that for most things that you'd come across, right? like
Yeah, but I think it's...
If your car window was broken or something tomorrow, you wouldn't go, oh, maybe God did that.
Well, if there's a religious... not with that. But yeah, if there's a religious context, I think some thought needs to be... That's the game changer, right? A religion authenticating context.
Or Christian specifically, I think you mean here as well, right? Because, of course...
No, any religion... If you're telling me about a Muslim miracle, I would give it that same 50-50 prior. In fact, that's what I did do when I studied the religions. I gave them that 50-50 prior for any miracles they claimed would authenticate their religion. And then I studied the evidence to see if it worked or not.
I think rather than me asserting that, I probably should have walked through a particular miracle that I think could do this for you. But I feel like I just not got really the time to do that right now. I don't know. Is there anything you want to say, James, to kind of close out? Because I really do need to go. If you want to make a last kind of statement or something.
Yeah, sorry, I kind of cut out a bit when you were talking about whether the Shroud covered the historical Jesus and that sort of stuff. But so I'm sorry if I made some remarks there that were interrupting or incoherent with what you were saying. I don't know what the issue with my internet is. I can't find a problem. But anyway, regarding the Shroud. So yeah, Dale, thanks very much for coming to chat with us. It's been generally good. I think the main frustration, which I've said before, is that most of your points rely on me just sort of trusting someone who's published a paper when you haven't actually shown the paper. And for me, that's thoroughly unconvincing of almost any claim that you could make, actually, unless it's something I already believed in. Just saying, oh, someone published a paper that shows this. I'd often disbelieve that, even if it's a plausible claim. And for something that I think is quite implausible, then it becomes even less likely that I'm going to accept that without being able to look at the details. And so I think it might be helpful if you're interested to share around a half dozen papers each or something that we think are relevant. You're probably already going to be familiar with some of the ones that we have, but and then we can look at the details in advance and then be able to discuss the evidence at the level of detail required to really make an assessment of it. That's because my main issue at the moment is that most of the things that you've raised are just there's not enough detail for me to assess, and based on what I can assess, I don't find it convincing.
Fair enough. I totally agree.
Yeah, so hopefully we can review this at some point in the future.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You got Fort Panther says he loves your willingness to talk, your calmness under pressure of two interlocutors. And yeah, I appreciate that as well, actually, because it's, two of us, one of you, and also I have a tendency sometimes when I feel I'm being misunderstood to get a bit frustrated, which could come across in my tone. And I think you've remained kind of calm whenever that's kind of happened to me as well. So I appreciate, that style of communication and everything too. So,
yeah, big kudos for coming on. Most people whom we cover, well, we didn't cover you directly, but we covered your topic, aren't willing to come on and chat to us. I really respect that a lot.
Yeah, I think it's crucial. I mean, especially in things like the Shroud of Turin, which is not really well respected or well known in scholarship. Trust me, as a philosopher, I've had people saying, like, "What are you doing? Why are you involved in that?" stuff like that. But I think dialogue and even debate, I don't know why people say debates are like a bad word. Everyone's like, no, it's a discussion, not a debate. Either way, it's two or more points coming together and rationally discussing the evidence for and both sides. We want to work together to get the truth. So, like I see, we're all in the same team as far as I see it, and I think these are very valuable. So yeah, I cherish discussion shows and debate shows and stuff.
Great. Well, people can check out your channel from here, Real Seekers. Obviously, James's channel, James Fodor, though I'm guessing most of my audience is probably familiar. Yeah, so thanks, everyone. Leave a like, share it around if you think people benefit, and, engage with it to make the metrics go up and give me that 5 pence ad revenue. So we become so big that Cameron will have to respond to us on Bad Apologetics. That's the...
There you go. Yeah. Cameron's had a few of my friends on the show. I've tried to get on his show or to bring experts to bring a different perspective, but he's got his theories, and okay, he brings experts to support that, and fair enough. But yeah,
you convert to Catholicism, he'll have you.
Oh goodness, yeah.
Or have a demon experience, and then you'll be right in there.
Yeah, he's really into that stuff. I think he's working on a documentary with my friend Caleb Jackson on demons.
Oh, with Caleb, right? Okay.
Caleb, yeah.
Oh, that's going to be so good. We're going to have to cover that one.
Yeah.
It's admittedly that's not my cup of tea and stuff, but yeah, we have disagreements on that. So
yeah, awesome. Well, thanks guys. I'm gonna end the stream there. Thank you, everyone.
Take care,
everyone.